In the stillness of the ancient world, Rome rises quietly, not as a place of battles or emperors, but as a city of ordinary days. Here, life unfolds slowly, with footsteps echoing on stone streets and soft breezes passing through tiled roofs. To listen to the story of Rome in its calmness is to drift through time itself, where nothing rushes, everything lingers in gentle detail. The first light of the Roman dawn came quietly, almost without notice, as though the sun itself wished not to disturb the peace of the eternal city. The darkness of the night softened, little by little, until the outlines of the rooftops became visible, their tiles catching the earliest hints of gold. A light mist hung over the hills, where olive trees stood motionless, their branches heavy with silence. The aqueducts, long ribbons of stone crossing valleys and plains, held a faint glow of morning against their arches, and the water within them moved with a sound too soft for most ears, as if whispering a secret to itself. In the countryside beyond the walls, the farmers were among the first to stir. They did not rise with urgency. The rhythm of their work was the same each day, and the fields did not demand haste. The plough would wait, the soil would wait, the oxen would stand patiently, their breath misting in the cool air. A farmer might sit on the edge of his wooden stool for a while before standing, rubbing his eyes slowly, stretching his arms, and greeting the day in silence. His wife might already be awake, tending to the small fire in the hearth, coaxing the embers back to life with gentle breaths and bits of dry kindling. The smoke curled upward in thin streams, filling the room with its familiar scent, a reminder of continuity, of a life lived one day at a time. In the city itself, Rome stretched and yawned, though it was far too vast to rise all at once. In narrow streets of the insulae, the tall apartment blocks that housed countless families remained hushed in the early moments, as though the walls themselves wished to remain asleep. A child turned over in his straw bed, drawing a worn blanket closer. A mother, already half awake, sat by a small oil lamp, trimming the wick with care so that its glow would last through the next hour. Flame flickered, casting long shadows against the wall, and the room seemed larger for it, though it was not more than a single chamber. Outside, the baker was one of the artisans to begin his work. Long before the city truly awakened, the bakery's ovens were glowing with heat. The smell of warm bread drifted slowly into the air, seeping through alleys and into doorways so gentle at first that few noticed it. Those who stirred early always knew where it came from, and they found comfort in the thought that bread was baking, yet nourishment was already being prepared. The bakery's stone oven gave off a steady warmth, and the baker, his hand coated in flour, worked with quiet determination, kneading the dough in slow, steady motions. There was no hurry. He had done this countless times and the dough responded best to patience. His arms ached, yet he had long grown used to the ache, and he found it almost soothing, the way one finds comfort in familiar effort. Along the aqueduct channels, the water continued its timeless journey, trickling and murmuring with the same constancy it had the day before, and with the day after. A woman filling her clay jug leaned over the fountain, watching the ripple form and disappear, as though time itself were carried in those small movements. She did not speak, nor did she need to. The task was shared by countless others, and the fountain gave freely to all, so long as one approached it with patience. The jug, once filled, grew heavy in her hands, and she lifted it carefully, balancing it against her hip as she walked back toward her dwelling. Each step stood softly on the stone, measured and even, as though part of a larger rhythm played by the city. The streets of Rome were not yet crowded, but the first carts began to roll across the paving stones, their wooden wheels creaking in slow protest. A donkey trotted lazily beside one such cart, carrying bundles of vegetables covered in rough cloth, their leaves poking through in muted shades of green. The driver hummed quietly to himself, not to entertain, to fill the stillness of the hour. His voice blended with the gentle sounds of hooves, creaks, and the soft rustle of wind moving through narrow passages between the buildings. Elsewhere, a patrician villa was also stirring, though with a slower, more deliberate rhythm. The atrium, with its central pool for collecting rainwater, glimmered faintly in the early light. Servants moved silently across the mosaic floors, carrying small lamps, opening shutters, and arranging the household for another day. They walked with care, their sandals making little noise. It was still the hour of transition between sleep and wakefulness. In one chamber, a master stretched upon his couch, his eyes half closed, unwilling yet to rise but also unwilling to drift back in deep sleep. He listened to the soft trickle of water from the fountain in the atrium, the sound steady and unchanging, and it seemed to him that Rome itself breathed through that fountain. Beyond the walls, the fields were touched by light, and the farmers led their oxen the furrows. The animals moved slowly, their steps heavy, but they knew their task well. Soil turned beneath the wooden plows, releasing the faint scent of earth, and birds circled above, cawing gently to one another. Nothing hurried here, either, for the fields yield in their own time, and no man could command the earth to rush. Farmers worked in steady silence, sometimes pausing to wipe their brows, sometimes leaning on the plough handles to watch the sun rise higher. The countryside stretched out in soft shades of green and brown, dotted with villas, groves, and patches of wildflowers bending slightly in the breeze. Back within the city, first sounds of conversation began to drift in the streets. A neighbor greeted another in low tones. The merchant adjusted his stall, arranging amphorae and baskets with care. The forum, still quiet, held the presence of marble columns and statues that seemed almost alive in the morning glow. Pigeons fluttered from one ledge to another, cooing gently, their wings catching the light for a moment before folding into stillness again. The vastness of the forum could be overwhelming at midday, filled with voices, debates, and movement. But in these early hours, it remained calm, as though waiting for the day to decide its pace. Even the Tiber River, ever flowing, seemed unhurried in the dawn. Its waters moved steadily, reflecting the soft colors of the sky. Fishermen checked their nets with patient hands and crouched upon the banks, others standing in their small boats that rocked gently against the current. They did not call out or chatter, for fishing required silence, and they had learned to let the river do its work in its own time. Nets rose slowly, dripping and glistening, revealing modest catches that shimmered in the morning light. These would feed families, be sold in markets, or roasted over fires. The day was gone. The river gave steadily, never too much, never too little, just as it had for generations. As the city warmed, the sounds grew slightly louder, though still far from hurried. The clang of a blacksmith's hammer echoed faintly, rhythmic and deliberate, not harsh but steady, like a heartbeat. The smith lifted the hammer, struck the metal, and waited before striking again, allowing the sound to fade before renewing it. Rocks flew, dim in the daylight, and the anvil carried the weight of centuries of such work. Across the way, a potter shaped clay upon his wheel, his hands wet and careful, coaxing form from shapelessness. The wheel turned with a soft hum, spinning endlessly, and the potter worked, as though time itself revolved with it. The Roman dawn continued, not with sudden energy, but with slow accumulation, each sound and sight layering gently upon the next. The baker, the farmer, the craftsman, told each part of the city joined into quiet chorus of life. The rhythm as old as Rome itself. Nothing was urgent, and nothing was forgotten. The eternal city awoke not with a roar, with a whisper, and in that whisper lay the story of countless lives, lived one moment at a time. As the sun rose higher, light spilled gently over the tiled rooftops, casting long shadows across the cobblestones. The streets, still not yet crowded, seemed to stretch into endless pathways, each one leading to small lives carried out in quiet repetition. An old man sat upon a low step, leaning upon his walking stick, watching the morning unfold without any need to join it quickly. His eyes followed the passing of a stray dog, tail wagging faintly, nose pressed close to the ground as it searched for scraps left from the night bee. The old man did not call to the dog, nor did he move. He simply watched, and the watching was enough. The city's temples stood, calm and unwavering, their marble surfaces touched by sunlight. Priests moved silently within, arranging small offerings and lighting incense that released thin threads of smoke curling toward the open sky. Fragrance drifted out into the streets, faint but noticeable, mingling with the scent of bread, herbs, and distant wood smoke. No prayers were spoken loudly, for the gods did not require noise. The priests whispered or remained entirely quiet, their gestures slow, their footsteps deliberate. Even the statues of the gods seemed to rest in the stillness, their carved faces serene and unchanging, as though they too were caught in the eternal rhythm of morning. In small courtyards, families gathered around modest meals. A bowl of porridge, some bread, a little cheese, nothing extravagant, filling enough to begin the day. Children chewed slowly, their eyes still heavy with sleep, while parents exchanged few words, their voices low and unhurried. A jug of water stood upon the table, cool and clear, and each member drank in turn, pressing the vessel carefully, handing as though it were precious. The simple act of eating together, repeated every day, carried with it a sense of permanence, of belonging not just to one another but to the city itself. Vendors, preparing their stalls for the coming hours, laid out goods with methodical care. A cloth was spread, smoothed again and again until it rested flat. Jars of olives, baskets of figs, amphorae of oil, each placed were beside the other in quiet order. The merchant paused often, stepping back to look, adjusting, then looking again, not out of vanity but from a desire to bring calmness to the display. A passerby might glance at the stall, nod, and move on. The merchant found satisfaction in the careful arrangement, knowing it was part of the day's ritual, the endless cycle of preparation and waiting. At the edges of the city, farmers' carts continued to arrive, their wheels marking faint tracks upon the dust. They entered the gates slowly, greeted by the guards not with suspicion but with routine familiarity. The guards themselves leaned upon their spears, exchanging occasional words but otherwise standing in silence, watching the world pass by without haste. For them too, the day was long and steady, marked not by excitement but by the turning of hours, each one blending into the next. The animals of Rome also stirred in their own time. Chickens clucked quietly in the courtyards, scratching at the ground with small, patient movements. Goats bleated softly from behind wooden fences, their heads bent toward bundles of hay. Horses tied near stables stamped their hooves gently, the sound echoing against stone walls in a slow, rhythmic pattern. None of the animals rushed, none of them seemed unsettled. They were part of the city's calm pulse, as natural to its mornings as the flow of water and the glow of fire. Somewhere in a shaded corner, a young boy traced shapes in the dust with a stick, lost in the small world he created. Circles, lines, patterns that held meaning only to him, yet he drew them with deep concentration. His mother, standing nearby, allowed him to continue without interruption, for she knew that such quiet play harmed nothing and perhaps brought the boy peace. She adjusted her shawl, glanced at the sky, and returned her gaze to her child, content simply to stand and watch. As the hours passed, more people appeared in the streets, though still without rush. Groups of men walked together toward the baths, carrying small bundles of towels. Their conversations were muted, more gestures than words, for they saved their talk for later, when the warm waters and steam would loosen both body and tongue. Women carrying baskets of fruit passed them, nodding politely but saying little. Even in these encounters, silence was as valuable as speech. The rhythm of walking mattered more than the exchange of words. In the distance, bells chimed softly, tones rolling across rooftops and valleys beyond the walls. The sound was slow, note fading before the next began, as though the bells themselves respected the city's measured pace. Those who heard them paused for a moment, listening, before continuing on. The bells mocked time, but not urge reminded, they did not command. By midday, Rome was awake, yet it still carried the calmness of its dawn. Even as the forum filled gradually with voices rose and fell in a pattern that was never harsh, more like a tide than a storm. Merchants called softly, baiting, men gestured with deliberate care, and children weaved pillars with the light steps of play. Statues watched in silence, columns stood unshaken, and fountains continued to murmur steadily, as they always had, always would. And in the quieter quarters, where life moved even more gently, the people of Rome carried on with tasks that seemed endless, yet never urgent. A woman spun wool upon her spindle, the thread growing slowly between her fingers. A man repaired a sandal with careful stitches, the leather soft beneath his hands. Another tended a small garden, pulling weeds one by one, placing each stone neatly along the path, pausing often to rest his back and wipe his brow. Every action was small, but every action filled the hours, and the hours stretched long, blending smoothly into one another. As the sun leaned toward afternoon, shadows lengthened once again, and the light upon the stones grew warmer. The eternal city remained what it had always been, not a place of sudden changes, but a place where time itself seemed to breathe slowly, endlessly repeating its rhythms. The dawn of Rome had passed, yet its calmness lingered, settling into every corner, every step, every sound. And so the first day, like countless days ere it, enfolded in stillness. Rome did not hurry, for Rome did not need to hurry. Its life was not built upon haste, upon the gentle turning of hours, the soft flow of water, the steady tread of feet upon stone. The people lived, the city breathed, and time moved forward, one quiet moment at a time. The city of Rome, when it had fully awakened, moved not in sudden bursts but in gentle patterns, where a river moves forward without seeming to rush. Its life was woven out of countless small tasks, repeated day after day, until they became more than mere habits. They became the rhythm of existence itself. The Romans did not need to think about this rhythm, for it surrounded them. It carried them. It was natural as the rising the sun and the setting of the same. A woman began her day by grinding grain. She bent over the quern stone, placing kernels into its hollow and turning the upper stone with slow circles her hands. The sound was steady and low, a soft scraping that filled the room like a murmur. She had done this for years, and she would do it for years to come. The grain became meal, and the meal would become bread, and the bread would be shared at a table where voices spoke softly and hands moved carefully. The work was repetitive, yet it held a calmness, for each motion carried the memory of the was-be. Elsewhere, man carried his tools across a quiet street. He was carpenter, and the wood he shaped did not require haste. He lifted planks, measured them by sight more often than by rule, and struck with his chisel in steady taps. The sound of wood being worked was not loud but patient, echoing faintly against the walls of nearby homes. He paused often to look at the grain, to feel the smoothness beneath his hand, and only then continued. In his shop, time did not pass quickly or slowly. It passed as always had, one tap, one cut, one polished surface at a time. Children, too, played according to the rhythm of daily life. Their games were not frantic but simple, stones arranged in circles, sticks drawn across the dust to make lines, little voices laughing in bursts, and then fading into quiet again. They did not keep track of hours, for children rarely do. They live inside the slow unfolding of the day, their energy rising and settling like waves upon a shore. A mother might call softly to one child, reminding him to eat or to fetch water, and the child would run for a moment, only to settle again into the easy stillness of the afternoon. The markets began to stir more fully as the sun lifted higher. Merchants arranged their stalls with practiced care, lifting baskets of olives, figs, or grapes, and setting them neatly upon wooden boards. Amphorae filled with oil or wine stood in rows, their clay surfaces catching the light. The smell of herbs drifted from one stall, mingling with the aroma of fish from another, some layering upon one another until the air itself seemed to carry the essence of Roman life. Misties called gently, not shouts, not cries, but the steady tone of bargaining. One person offered, another countered, conversation stretching out like a thread, back and forth, until agreement was reached, and when it was, the exchange was calm. A nod, a coin, a measured word of thanks. Near the fountains, women filled jugs of water, their movements careful and unhurried. The water fell in a steady trickle, clear and cool, its sound never changing. The fountains were places of gathering, yet they were never loud. Words passed between neighbors, greetings were exchanged, questions were asked about family, always in tones that suited the hour, never breaking the soft atmosphere that the water itself seemed to guard. Children leaned over the edges, dipping their fingers into the flow, watching ripples spread outward until they vanished. In such moments, even a child could sense that time was not something to be rushed. Bathhouses too became part of the day's rhythm. Men entered slowly, some alone, some with companions, their voices blending with the sound of splashing water. Cloaks were folded, sandals aside, bodies lowered into the warmth of pools that had welcomed countless others. The baths were not places of haste. They were places where time stretched, where conversations meandered without purpose, where the steam itself seemed to blur the edges of hours. Some bathed quickly, others lingered, but all were caught in the same flow, the same gentle surrender to the passing of time. In homes both small and grand, meals were prepared with equal steadiness. A pot simmered over a fire, its surface trembling gently with bubbles. A hand stirred slowly, watching herbs dissolve, lentils soften, vegetables release their flavor into the broth. Bread was placed upon a board, sliced not in a rush but with careful pressure. Each piece passed in its turn. The meal might be simple, bread, porridge, cheese, fruit, or it might be more elaborate, meats and sauces, yet in either case the preparation held the same unhurried rhythm. Those who ate did so together, not quickly, but with pauses between bites, with words spoken softly, with silence held just as often as speech. And so the day unfolded. Rhythm was not only in tasks but in movements, in the way people walked. Sanders met stone in even beats, steps echoing gently, never pounding. Carts moved slowly, wheels creaking in a way that marked time as surely as a clock might in another age. The shadows shifted across walls. Narrow alleys grew brighter and then dim again, and all of it happened without anyone commanding it to. It was simply the natural measure of Roman life. As afternoon approached, the rhythm did not falter. Craftsmen continued their labors, each strike of hammer or brush of hand blending into the long song of the city. A potter spun his wheel, shaping clay that had no will of its own but followed the guidance of patient fingers. A weaver passed thread over thread, a shuttle moving back and forth with a sound so faint it could be mistaken for a whisper. A scribe bent over parchment, tip up his stylus scratching letters one by one, careful not to rush, for mistakes were difficult to erase. Every sound, every motion carried the same quiet persistence, the same endless repetition that gave life its shape. In this way, Rome was alive not with noise, but with patterns. People did not hurry to finish, for nothing was ever truly finished. Grain would need grinding again, wood would need shaping again, meals would need cooking again. The tasks returned with each dawn, so they were performed with the understanding that they would never truly end. This knowledge did not weigh heavily. It soothed. It meant that tomorrow would be like today, and today was like yesterday. Within that sameness lay a comfort deeper than novelty. The eternal city breathed in cycles. Those cycles carried its people along. The rhythm of daily life was not a burden, but a lullaby, soft and steady, reminding all who lived within its walls that life was not meant to be rushed. It was meant to be lived slowly, a repeated act after another, until the day gave way to night, and night gave way to dawn once more. As the afternoon deepened, the city seemed to settle into a softer version of its own rhythm. The sun, now higher and warmer, poured its light over the stones of streets and courtyards, but even in the brightness, Rome did not quicken. Instead, pace grew gentler still, as though the heat itself reminded everyone to slow their steps, to let the hours pass without strain. Men shaded their eyes beneath cloaks or wide-brimmed hats, women adjusted their veils more carefully, and children found shaded corners where they could sit and trace patterns in the dust with sticks. Shops stood open, business was never rushed. A man selling oil measured it out with deliberate care, pouring from amphora into smaller vessels, ensuring that not a drop was wasted. He wiped the clay-lipped the jar with a cloth, tied the stopper with twine, and handed it over slowly, waiting for the weight of coin in return. The buyer counted the coins one by one, placing each into the merchant's hand as though the act itself was as important as the oil. No hurry, oil had waited in its jar for weeks. It could wait a few more moments to change hands. At another stall, cloths were folded, and folded again as custom ran their fingers over the weaves. A deep red-dyed fabric, a pale linen, darker wool. Each was examined not quickly but with time, stretched out into pauses and murmurs of thought. The merchant spoke softly, offering a word about the dye, about the strength of the thread, about how it had been woven. Customer nodded, asked again, weighed the answer. A bargain lasted the length of an hour, with no frustration on either side. The rhythm of buying and selling was not about speed, it was about the process itself, the ritual of exchange, the comfort of routine. Elsewhere, on quieter streets, neighbors leaned upon thresholds, speaking of little matters. The growth of vines in a garden, the behavior of a household dog, the small cough of a child that had now faded. These were matters of urgency, but they were the fabric of daily life, and to speak of them was to reaffirm the slow companionship of living side by side. Birds drifted back and forth, not rushed, not forced, but rising and falling like the hum of bees in a field. Even the animals with the city followed the same rhythm. Oxen that pulled carts in the morning now rested in shaded stalls, their heavy heads lowered, their breathing steady. Birds perched upon the edges of fountains, dipping their beaks into water, fluttering briefly, and then returning to stillness. Cats wandered quietly along walls and under tables, pausing often, moving in slow arcs that seemed to echo the pace of the people themselves. In the larger villas, servants carried on their duties with the same measured calm. A floor was swept with long, unhurried strokes of a broom. A jug of wine was poured carefully, the liquid flowing in a steady stream into cups of clay or silver. A child's tunic was washed in a basin, the fabric pressed again and again against the surface of water until it softened. These were not tasks to be hurried, for they were returned tomorrow and the day after. The rhythm of labor was endless, yet in its endlessness lay its calmness. By late afternoon, meals were taken once again. Bread, fruits, olives, perhaps fish or meat depending on the household, all shared slowly in the shade of walls or beneath open courtyards. Conversations continued, but they did not rush forward. They circled and returned, like the slow turning of a millstone. The taste of food lingered in the mouth. The coolness of water lingered on the tongue. Time itself seemed to stretch during these meals, and no complained that it stretched too far. As shadows lengthened, many turned once again toward the baths. Some had visited in the morning. The rhythm of the day often called them back in the later hours, when the heat of the sun could be washed away in warm pools, and cool plunges. Men and women spoke quietly within their separate chambers, steam rising around them in soft clouds. The sound of dripping water echoed against the stone, steady and changing almost like the ticking of a clock in another age. Here too, rhythm was unhurried, the rituals of bathing blending into the rituals of conversation, the body refreshed as the hours passed. The streets grew quieter again as evening approached. Merchants packed their stalls with care, folding cloth, gathering baskets, covering jars, tying ropes. Each item was placed away as slowly as it had been set out in the morning. Some stalls closed early, others lingered, but all knew that tomorrow the process would repeat itself. There was no need to rush today, for today will return in another form tomorrow. Children were called home, their games ending with soft laughter and the promise of more play in the morning. Their voices faded from the alleys, replaced by the sound of footsteps. Families walking together, their sandals pressing rhythm into stone. Lamps were lit within houses, their small flames flickering, casting light that swayed upon walls. The rhythm of daily life did not end with daylight, it simply shifted in the slower, gentle beat of night. And so, as the sky dimmed and the city prepared for rest, the rhythm that had guided the day continued. It was the rhythm of grain being ground, of cloth being folded, of water trickling, of footsteps measured, voices rising and falling without urgency. It was a rhythm that had existed long before this day, and would exist long after it. People of Rome moved within like leaves upon a stream, carried along not by force but by inevitability. The eternal city, vast and enduring, lived not in great events alone, but in these quiet, repeated patterns. It was not battles or speeches that filled most days, but bread baked in ovens, wool spun upon spindles, sandals worn upon familiar paths. And in these small, steady acts, the city found its life, a life that stretched on without hurry, bound to the timeless rhythm of existence itself. Within the walls of Rome, beyond the streets and markets, life unfolded quietly inside the homes where families lived, worked, and rested. Each dwelling, whether large or small, carried its own rhythm, a pulse of daily existence that was steady and unhurried. The city may have appeared vast from the outside, filled with monuments and forums, but its true heart beat softly behind doorways, within courtyards, in kitchens warmed by fire and rooms shaded from the sun. The humblest homes, the insulae of the crowded districts, were made of brick and stone, rising several stories high. Narrow staircases wound upward, their steps worn smooth by countless feet. The rooms were small, sometime only a single chamber. But even here life found its shape. A mat of straw in the corner became a bed, a low stool served as both seat and table, and an oil lamp, placed carefully upon a ledge, cast a faint circle of light that stretched across walls. Families lived close to one another, their voices carrying through thin partitions, yet they did not complain, for this closeness was part of the rhythm of Roman life. When one neighbor baked bread, the scent drifted through the hallways. When another hummed a tune to soothe a child, the sound passed easily into the next room, joining households together in quiet ways. The hearth, in every home, was the true center. It was here that meals were prepared, where warmth gathered in colder seasons, where small flames flickered in endless repetition. A woman crouched before the hearth, arranging kindling, blowing softly to coax sparks into life. The fire answered in slow breaths, growing from ember to flame, its glow warming her face as she fed it carefully. A pot was set above the flames, water poured within, herbs added one by one. The fragrance rose gently, filling the space with the scent of rosemary, thyme, or garlic. The pot bubbled in no rush, steam curling upward in lazy strands that lingered beneath the ceiling. Children sat nearby, watching, waiting, their eyes following each motion as though it were a ritual of endless importance. In wealthier villas, the rooms were larger, the courtyards open to the sky, with columns standing in measured lines around pools of water. The atrium shone with polished marble, its mosaics telling stories of gods, of animals, of patterns that swirled without end. Yet even here, beneath painted ceilings and behind carved doors, the rhythm of life was the same. Fires still burned, bread was still broken, voices still rose in the same gentle tones. The villa might have more space, more ornament. Its heart was different from the insular single chamber. The hearth, the family, the daily cycle of rest and nourishment. Servants in such households moved quietly through corridors, their sandals soft oft against the stone. They carried trays of fruit, jars of wine, bowls of olives, each step steady, each gesture measured. Their tasks were endless, yet none were hurried, for to rush would disturb the calm order of the home. A master reclined upon a couch in the triclinium. the dining room, while companions sat nearby, eating slowly, speaking in turns, pausing between words to let silence settle comfortably. The rhythm of the hearth extended outward, from kitchen to hall to garden, binding each part of the villa in a calm and steady flow. Children played in courtyards, their games quiet, their laughter rising in bursts and then fading again into stillness. They drew patterns on the tiles with chalk or traced small figures in the dust, their voices mixing with the sound of birds that perched along the rooflines. Their mothers watched from shaded doorways, sewing or spinning wool as the hours passed, their hands working with threads while their eyes followed the play. Nothing urgent stirred these moments. The work of the home, washing, weaving, was constant, and because it was constant, it could be done slowly. The same task will return tomorrow, and so there was no need to finish it quickly today. Evenings brought the household together. Lamps were lit, the fire trembling softly, casting warm circles of light. Hearth fire glowed brighter shadows stretching long upon the walls. Families gathered around simple meals, bread dipped in oil, cheese shared in small pieces, fruit sliced carefully and passed from hand to hand. Words were spoken, but not always many. Often silence was as comforting as speech. A father might tell a short tale of the gods, his voice low and even, while children listened with heavy eyelids, their minds drifting between story and sleep. The mother refilled cups of water or wine, adjusting a blanket upon a child's shoulders, moving with the same steady rhythm that guided the day. In the villas of the countryside, the rhythm of hearth and home was even quieter. Beyond the noise of the city, the air was filled only with the sound of crickets at dusk, the distant call of an ox, the rustle of wind through vines and olive trees. Here families sat beneath open skies, their homes surrounded by fields, their lives tied to the soil. The hearth still glowed, the same as in the city, but around it the silence stretched farther, embracing not only the home but the hills and valleys beyond. Meals were eaten slowly, the talk gentle, the tasks fewer, night longer. The stars watched as steadily as the fire burned, and the rhythm of the home joined with the rhythm of the land. Each home, large or small, carried within it the same truth, that life was built not upon great events, but upon the endless repetition of small acts. To light the fire, to share a meal, to weave cloth, to tell a story, close the door at night and open again at dawn. These were the true foundations of Roman life. The hearth was more than flame, it was memory, continuity, calmness given shape. And in its glow day after day, Rome found its quiet heart. The walls of Roman homes, where the simple brick or carefully painted plaster carried the breath of the people within them. They heard footsteps at dawn, the soft crackle of wood at the hearth, the murmur of prayers spoken before meals. They absorbed years of quiet repetition, of evenings spent beneath lamplight, of mornings filled with the clatter of clay cups set upon wooden tables. These walls did not shout with history, they whisper it, and their whispers were of ordinary lives unfolding slowly, one day at a time. In the modest insulae, walls bore marks of less families who had lived in those same chambers. A faint stain where a lamp had once hung, a groove where a bed frame had leaned. A faint layer of smoke where the small cooking fire had curled upward for years. New tenants arrived, placed the few belongings inside, and took up the same rhythm, cooking where others had cooked, sleeping where others had slept. Nothing changed quickly, for the rooms taught their own pace, the kind of pace where mornings began with a stretch, with the careful tying of sandals, with the slow folding of blankets. In villas of the countryside, the walls were brighter, covered in colors that depicted gardens, birds, fruits, and landscapes. These paintings brought the outside world inside, but even in their liveliness, they conveyed stillness. Birds perched upon painted branches never moved, fruits upon painted platters never spoiled, gardens along painted paths never faded. Guests reclining upon couches might glance at these scenes and feel as though they themselves were resting inside the painted calm. The walls became companions, silent keepers of the stillness of the home. At the heart of these spaces was always the hearth. Fire was not simply practical, it was spiritual. The goddess Vesta was honored in Rome as the guardian of the hearth. The Romans believed that the flame in each home echoed the sacred flame burning in her temple. Families placed small offerings beside their fire. A pinch of grain, a piece of fruit, a crumb of bread. These acts were not loud rituals but quiet gestures, reminders that life was fragile, that warmth and nourishment depended upon steady care. As the flames rose and fell, families felt their own lives reflected in the gentle dance of the fire. Children grew up around these hearths, learning their first lessons in patience and repetition. A child sat beside the fire, watching an elder weave wool upon a spindle. The wheel turned slowly, the thread lengthened gradually, and the child's eyes followed without hurry. Another child pressed clay between small hands, shaping it into a simple cup. The rhythm of shaping repeated again and again until the form was complete. These tasks were not rushed. In Roman homes, time itself seemed to move in wide, slow circles. Meals, too, were circles of repetition. Bread was kneaded, baked, eaten daily. Olive oil was poured from jars that had been refilled again and again through the seasons. Wine diluted with water was sipped in cups, the same motion repeated at every meal. The food was not always rich. In poorer homes it was often humble. Porridge of grain, beans boiled until soft, vegetables stewed until tender. Yet it was not the richness of the meal that mattered, but the calmness with which it was shared. Families sat together, hands moving slowly, voices gentle, silences comfortable. Eating was not a task to be hurried through, but a pause in the day when the rhythm of life grew especially soft. When visitors arrived, they were welcomed not with extravagance but with steadiness. A guest entered, sandals dusted from the street, and was offered a seat, perhaps a cushion, perhaps a simple stool. A cup of water or wine was placed by them. Bread was set upon the table. Conversation began slowly, with questions of health, of family, of the weather. No rush to deep matters, it was enough simply to share space, to let words settle between sips, to let silences grow without discomfort. Hospitality in Roman homes was not loud. It was a gentle extension of the hearth outward, making strangers feel the warmth of belonging. As daylight faded, the rooms shifted into evening calm. Oil lamps were lit one by one, their flames flickering like small stars within the chambers. The hearth fire glowed deeper, no longer used for cooking, for warmth and light. Shadows stretched gently across mosaics, across walls, across wooden beams. Families gathered closer, the outer doors closed against the night. The world outside growing hushed. Children leaned against their mothers, eyes heavy, while fathers recited short verses or told familiar tales. The hours lengthened as though time itself to wish to rest beside them. In wealthier homes, evenings might include soft music. A lyre was plucked gently, its strings resonating in slow waves. A flute released a breathy tone, rising and falling without force. Listeners reclined with half-closed eyes, the notes blurring into the crackle of fire and the faint rustle of fabric. Music in these moments did not stir the heart, it quieted it, coaxing the mind into stillness, inviting sleep even as voices murmured in the background. The bedrooms of Roman homes were not elaborate. A simple bed frame, often of wood, held a mattress of straw or wool. Blankets of woven cloth lay across it, heavy enough for cool nights, light enough for summer warmth. Children might share beds, curled together beneath a single cover, their breathing soft and steady. In wealthier villas, the bedding was finer, the blankets dyed or embroidered, but the purpose was the same: to rest, to surrender the day, to let the rhythm of life continue in silence. Outside, the streets of Rome quieted, but inside the homes the silence deepened further. Lamps were extinguished one by one, their smoke rising in thin trails before fading into darkness. The hearth burned lower, embers glowing red, releasing heat in gentle pulses. The city might dream of triumphs, of battles, of politics. Within each home there was only the dream of sleep, of families resting close, of walls holding the warmth of life until morning returned. Thus the homes and hearts of Rome carried the city through time, not in sudden bursts of glory, but in the patient glow of countless evenings, countless meals, countless fires tended and extinguished. Rome endured not only through emperors and monuments, yet through the quiet persistence of families who rose, who worked, who ate, who rested, who kept the flame alive within their walls. And when the world outside grew uncertain, when rulers changed, when fortunes shifted, the hearth within remained steady, a small light in the vastness of history, repeating itself night after night in the calmest of rhythms. And so the story of Roman homes was not a story of grandeur, but of stillness. It was not a tale of noise, but of whispers. It was not a history of battles, but of fires burning quietly in kitchens, of children falling asleep beside their mothers, of fathers mending tools by lamplight. It was the history of daily life, which, though humble, stretched across centuries with a patience stronger than stone. In the hush of these homes, Rome's true heart rested, and within their hearths, the eternal city found its quiet eternity. Servants in such households moved quietly through corridors, their sandals soft against the stone. They carried trays of fruit, jars of wine, bowls of olives, each step steady, each gesture measured. The tasks were endless, yet none were hurried, for to rush would disturb the calm order of the home. A master reclined upon a couch in the triclinium, the dining room, while companions sat nearby, eating slowly, speaking in pausing between words to let silence settle comfortably. The rhythm of the hearth extended outward from kitchen to hall to garden, binding each part of the villa in a calm and steady flow. Children played in courtyards, their games quiet, their laughter rising in bursts and then fading again into stillness. They drew patterns upon the tiles with chalk or traced small figures in the dust, their voices mixing with the sound of birds that perched along the rooflines. Their mothers watched from shaded doorways, sewing as the hours passed, their hands working with threads while their eyes followed the play. Nothing urgent stirred these moments. The work of the home, washing, weaving, was constant, and because it was constant, it could be done slowly. The same task will return tomorrow, and so there was no need to finish it quickly today. Evenings brought the household together. Lamps were lit, their flames trembling softly, casting warm circles of light. The hearth fire glowed brighter, shadows stretching long upon the walls. Families gathered round simple meals, bread dipped in oil, cheese shared in small pieces, fruit sliced carefully and passed from hand to hand. Words were spoken, but not always many. Often silence was as comforting as speech. A father might tell a short tale of the gods, his voice low and even, while children listened with heavy eyelids, their minds drifting between story and sleep. The mother refilled cups of water or wine, adjusting a blanket upon a child's shoulders, moving with the same steady rhythm that guided the day. In the villas of the countryside, the rhythm of hearth and home was even quiet. Beyond the noise of the city, the air was filled only with the sound of crickets at dusk, the distant call of an ox, the rustle of wind through vines and olive trees. Here families sat beneath open skies, their homes surrounded by fields, their lives tied to the soil. The hearth still glowed the same as in the city, but around it the silence stretched farther, embracing not only the home but the hills and valleys beyond. Meals were eaten slowly, the talk gentle, the task fewer, night longer. The stars watched as steadily as the fire burned, and the rhythm of home joined with the rhythm of the land. Each home, large or small, carried within it the same truth, that life is built not upon great events, but upon the endless repetition of small acts. To light the fire, to share a meal, to weave cloth, to tell a story, close the door at night and open it again at dawn. These were the true foundations of Roman life. The hearth was more than flame. It was memory, continuity, calmness given shape. And in its glow day after day, Rome found its quiet heart.
The streets of Rome were not always the grand avenues sung about in stories, nor the noisy roads filled with the clamours of markets and soldiers. In truth, they were often smaller, winding, and alive in ways that were subtle rather than overwhelming. At dawn, when the city was only beginning to wake, the stones of the roads were cool, damp with night's breath. A few early footsteps echoed across them, sandals striking the uneven surfaces with slow, deliberate rhythm. The city stretched itself awake in silence, and the streets became long corridors of waiting. A quiet passerby might pause to notice how the light touched the walls. The first rays of sun softened the hard outlines of stone buildings, making them appear less imposing, more welcoming. Shadows clung to doorways and corners, and the streets looked less like thoroughfares of a busy empire and more like sleeping veins within a body at rest. The silence was not emptiness, it was expectation. Rome's life would flow into these passages, but for a brief moment each morning they remained hushed, suspended in a calm that felt eternal. The stones themselves had borne the weight of countless steps and wheels. Carts rolled over them by day, carrying goods of clay, of oil, of grain, yet by night those same stones lay undisturbed, cooling beneath the stars. They held memory, the memory of parades, of soldiers returning, of children running, of merchants calling. But they also remembered quieter moments, the whisper of a broom sweeping dust aside, the soft padding of a cat moving between shadows, the distant drip of water from a rooftop after rain. These small sounds stitched the fabric of the streets together, making them as much a part of Rome's life as its monuments. Public spaces, too, carried this rhythm. The forums where crowds gathered in daylight also knew the quiet of emptiness. At dawn and dusk, the great plazas lay still, their stones pale and cool, their columns standing like watchful sentinels. Voices that once rose in debate, in laughter, in commerce, had faded with the setting sun, leaving behind only the faint rustle of wind between marble facades. A passerby wandering through at such times might feel the immensity of the city, not in its noise but in its silence. as though the stones themselves breathed slowly, waiting for the day to begin again. The fountains scattered through the streets and squares flowed without hurry, their waters murmuring in endless repetition. In the heat of the day, people approached them with clay jars, with cups with cupped hands. But in the stillness of early morning or late evening, the fountains sang only to themselves. Their streams fell steadily, breaking the silence not with disruption but with a soft, endless lullaby. The water was never in haste, and its calm voice filled the public spaces with the assurance that life, no matter how busy in the hours between, always returned to stillness. As the day unfolded, the streets welcomed their ordinary rhythms. Merchants unrolled their mats or opened their wooden shutters with motions repeated across generations. Their goods, baskets of figs, pots of honey, bolts of wool, were displayed with care. Voices began to hum, but even these were not sharp at first. They rose like the murmur of a brook, soft and steady, growing louder only as more feet filled the streets. Shoppers leaned close to inspect, to ask, to gesture, yet even here in commerce there was a certain patience. Transactions were conversations, not hurried exchanges. Each coin dropped into a hand carried the slow weight of agreement. Children appeared soon after, their laughter rising higher, their sandals slapping more quickly against the stones. Yet even their noise carried a softness, for the streets absorbed sound and transformed it into something less harsh. Often their games, tossing pebbles, chasing one another, inventing contests with chalk marks on walls, were small echoes of joy within the vast city. The adults nearby scarcely minded, for the laughter was not disruption, but a thread in the tapestry of the street's life. Public baths, so essential to Roman life, also reflected this gentle rhythm. From the outside, their structures seemed large and imposing, but inside they were spaces of calm repetition. The sound of water trickling into pools, the hushed conversation of neighbours, the quiet movement of attendants carrying towels, all of it merged into an atmosphere that soothed the body and stilled the mind. Bathers sank slowly into warm water, closed their eyes, and let the hours pass without urgency. These were not moments of indulgence, but of pause, woven seamlessly into the everyday fabric of life. Beyond the heart of the city, the streets grew narrower, quieter still. Here, laundry lines hung between windows, swaying lightly in the breeze. The scent of bread drifted from bakeries, mingling with the faint aroma of herbs. A woman watered her small pots of plants, drops falling gently into soil. A man sat on a stool, mending a sandal with careful hands. Life in these streets was measured not by the rush of crowds, but by the steady rhythm of small, repeated gestures. Each movement was a piece of the day, placed carefully upon the others until evening arrived again. When twilight returned, the city softened once more. The stalls were packed away, shutters drawn, and carts rolled slowly homeward. The stones of the streets, warmed by the day's sun, released their heat in faint waves. Lamps were lit along the main roads, their flames small but steady, glowing in the deepening shadows. Voices dwindled, replaced again by the quiet of night. Cats moved silently along the walls, their eyes reflecting lamplight. A final broom brushed across a doorstep. Then, gradually, silence took hold once more. The streets did not sleep entirely, they dreamed. They dreamed in the echoes of footsteps long past, in the faint hum of fountains, in the slow fading of firelight through windows. Public spaces, empty again, stretched wide and patient beneath the stars. The city seemed to rest as a body does, not ceasing to live, but sinking into calm, gathering strength for the day that would follow. In these moments, one could feel the true pulse of Rome, not in its armies, not in its conquests, not in its wealth, but in the gentle repetition of streets lived in by ordinary people. A boy walking home, holding his mother's hand, a baker sweeping crumbs from his table. A traveller pausing beneath an archway to watch the last light fade. These simple motions, repeated endlessly across the centuries, formed the quiet heartbeat of the eternal city. At night, when most of Rome lay quiet, certain streets still carried the faintest traces of life. A night watchman walked slowly, his footsteps measured, his torch flickering in the dark. His presence was not alarming but steady, as though he were a caretaker of the city's dreams. Occasionally, a cart rolled by, its wheels muffled against the stone, carrying goods to be ready for the next day's markets. The driver sat drowsily, guiding the mule at a pace that seemed to stretch the night longer rather than shorten it. These sounds were soft intrusions, swallowed quickly by the stillness, leaving silence as the city's main companion once more. The great colonnades, those rows of marble columns in public squares and temples, also knew this silence well. In daylight, they echoed with footsteps and voices, their polished surfaces reflecting movement and colour. But under moonlight, they stood unmoving, pale and tall like solemn guardians watching over Rome. The shadows they cast were long and cool, draping the plazas in patterns of calm geometry. Those who wandered here in late hours felt less the grandeur of architecture and more the peace of stillness, as if the city itself had closed its eyes. The Tiber River, flowing at the city's edge, lent its own calm voice to Rome's public life. During the day, it was busy with barges carrying goods, with men loading sacks and crates. But at night, its surface smoothed into quiet silver, rippling gently under the stars. The water whispered against its banks, patient and unending. Bridges that spanned the river stood dark and quiet, their arches mirrored in the flowing surface below. Travellers who crossed at night heard only the soft rush of water, a sound so steady and timeless it seemed to erase the noise of the day. Fountains, too, became more pronounced in the quiet of night. Their flowing streams, unnoticed amid the chatter of daytime crowds, now stood out as the clearest voices of the city. In small courtyards, water trickled into stone basins, its rhythm constant, soothing, familiar. Some households kept tiny fountains within their walls, and even in the stillest hours, the faint splash of water reminded them of continuity. The cycle of life never paused, but never hurried. For a listener drifting towards sleep, these fountains spoke a language of rest, endlessly repeating, never demanding, always calming. The public baths, though emptied of bathers by evening, retained an air of softness. The pools lay still, their surfaces dark mirrors reflecting the lamplight of attendants tidying the rooms. Echoes lingered in the high ceilings, soft remnants of conversations now gone. The scent of oils clung faintly to the air. One could almost imagine the baths themselves resting, like living beings who had worked all day and now took their own quiet pause. In the stillness, the grand halls felt smaller, more intimate, as though they too had folded into slumber. Markets left their own kind of silence behind. Stalls stood closed, awnings tied back, counters cleared. Yet faint traces of the day's life lingered. The smell of bread, though fading, still touched the air. A grape or two might remain in the dust, a reminder of hands that had passed them only hours before. Cats prowled here, finding crumbs and scraps, their movements part of the nightly rhythm. The markets were not abandoned, but rather exhaled, emptied of activity, so they might inhale it again with morning light. Their calm was like the pause between breaths. Even the amphitheatres, places of performance and spectacle, became still in their own way. By day, they rang with applause or shouts, but at night they stood empty, the benches cold, the stage quiet. The silence within these great spaces was almost profound, as though the stones themselves were remembering past voices, storing them until the next gathering. To sit quietly in such a place after the crowds had left was to feel the contrast between noise and peace, to realise that even the loudest corners of Rome eventually bowed to the hush of night. In quieter neighbourhoods, narrow alleys carried domestic sounds into the open. A mother singing softly to a child, a low conversation drifting from an open window, the creak of a chair as someone leaned back after a long day. These small, private notes filled the air with gentleness. Dogs curled themselves in doorways, their breathing slow, their ears twitching only when a distant sound passed. The life here was not public but intimate, yet it belonged to the streets all the same, blending into the calmness of the city as naturally as water joins a stream. At the heart of Rome, the Forum itself, so alive in daylight, offered a lesson in quiet grandeur. By night, its arches and temples seemed larger, not through movement, but through stillness. The absence of voices magnified the presence of stone. Columns stretched upward into the starlight, and broken statues stood unmoving, their outlines softened by shadow. A wanderer here might feel the hum of history beneath the silence, a reminder that even the greatest empires rest in between their moments of glory. The Forum did not need crowds to feel important. Its calm presence was enough. The lamps that dotted the main streets flickered gently, their flames moving with the faintest currents of night air. Each lamp illuminated only a small circle of stone, leaving the rest in cool shadow. Together, they created islands of light, a rhythm of brightness and darkness along the roads. Those walking home passed in and out of these circles, their shadows lengthening and vanishing into... The lamps were humble guardians, not strong enough to challenge the night, but steady enough to guide one safely through it. Their glow was less about brilliance and more about reassurance. In the far edges of the city, where the streets thinned into paths leading toward countryside villas, the quiet deepened further. Here, the hum of the city faded almost completely, leaving only the faint rustle of leaves, the occasional call of a night bird, and the distant murmur of water. Villas stood behind walls, their windows glowing faintly with lamplight. Within, families gathered for final conversations before sleep, their voices too faint to carry far. To walk here was to feel the boundary between Rome's public heart and the world beyond, a boundary marked not by walls or gates, but by the deepening silence itself. And always, above it all, the sky watched. Stars pricked the dark expanse, unmoved by the city below. The moon traced its quiet arc, sometimes reflected in the Tiber, sometimes veiled by thin clouds. The heavens paid little attention to the empire's noise or silence, yet their steady presence gave meaning to both. Rome's streets, no matter how busy or quiet, lay always under the same stars, reminding its people that the rhythm of life was part of something far larger, far calmer than themselves. So the gentle streets and public spaces of Rome moved through their days and nights, through noise and stillness, with the patience of stone and water. Each morning brought footsteps, each evening brought silence, each night returned the city to rest. The eternal city lived not only in its grand triumphs and bustling markets, but also in these quiet cycles, repeated endlessly until they became as eternal as the city's name. For those drifting towards sleep, these streets invite not urgency, but ease. They remind us that even the busiest places eventually grow calm, that even the loudest voices fade into whispers, and that stillness waits patiently beneath all movement. The streets of Rome, gentle and enduring, are always there, holding silence as carefully as they hold life. The city of Rome, with its marble columns, crowded markets, and gentle fountains, was only part of the empire's life. Beyond its walls stretched another world, quieter and slower, where the rhythm of life was measured not by footsteps on stone, but by the rising and setting of the sun, the flowing of rivers, and the turning of the seasons. This was the Roman countryside, a wide expanse of fields and hills, of orchards and olive groves, of farms both modest and grand. Here, the empire's true strength rested, for the countryside gave Rome its bread, its wine, its oil, and its peace. To walk out of the city and into this land was to feel time change. The clatter of wheels faded, the murmur of crowds softened, and the air itself seemed lighter, touched by grass and soil rather than smoke and stone. Paths wound outward, some paved with stones, others simple tracks trodden by feet and hooves. Along these paths one might pass a villa with its orderly walls, or a small farmstead where chickens scratched in the dust and goats grazed nearby. Each step away from the city was a step into a slower rhythm, where daily life unfolded like the gentle sweep of the countryside itself. Fields were the first and most constant companions here. Wheat grew in vast stretches, swaying lightly when breezes moved across them. The stalks, pale green in spring and golden by summer, were the heart of Rome's diet. Farmers tended them carefully, rising early to walk the rows, checking the soil, guarding against pests. Harvest time brought steady work, not hurried but patient, as men and women cut the grain with sickles, tied it into bundles, and stacked it in neat rows. From the city, bread was seen as a given. A loaf at the market stall, a meal on the table. But in the countryside, each loaf began with the quiet labour of fields, repeated year after year, as constant as the seasons themselves. Vineyards added their own softness to the land. Rows of grapevines, twisted and strong, lined the gentle slopes of hills. In spring, their leaves unfolded in pale green clusters. In summer, they thickened, shading the grapes that swelled beneath. By autumn, the vines were heavy with fruit, deep purple and fragrant, ready for picking. Families moved through the rows, their baskets filling slowly, their voices low and steady. The air carried the sweetness of ripening fruit, a scent that clung to hands and clothes. In courtyards, grapes were pressed, their juice gathered in clay jars, left to transform into the wine that would later fill cups in city taverns and noble villas alike. Yet here in the countryside, it was not the drink that mattered, but the quiet care of vines through every season, pruning, tying, waiting, olive groves spread across the hills in quieter majesty still. Their trees stood twisted and ancient, their silver-green leaves catching the light in soft glimmers. Each tree seemed patient, as though it had seen many generations pass, yet still gave its fruit in due time. Harvesting olives was steady work, often done by hand. The fruit dropped gently onto cloths spread below. Later, stones pressed the olives into oil, thick and golden, a substance that lit lamps, flavoured meals, and soothed skin. To the countryside, olive oil was not luxury but life itself, as constant and useful as water. The trees stood season after season, their roots deep in soil, their branches open to sky, their presence a quiet lesson in endurance. Beyond the cultivated fields lay pastures, where flocks and herds grazed under the watch of shepherds. Sheep dotted the slopes, their woolly backs blending with the pale grasses, their soft bleating carried on the wind. Goats clambered on rocky hillsides, nibbling at shrubs, their bells tinkling gently. Cows moved more slowly, their heavy steps stirring dust, their low voices rumbling like distant thunder. For the shepherd, the day was long but peaceful, guiding the animals to water, keeping them safe from straying, sitting on a stone with a simple flute, filling the air with quiet tunes. The animals provided milk, wool, meat and hides, but more than that, they shaped the rhythm of life in the countryside, a rhythm that was slow, steady and enduring. In the smaller farmyards, life unfolded in small ordinary cycles. Hens pecked at the earth, scattering dust with their wings. Pigs rooted in the soil, snuffling contentedly. Children carried water jars from wells, their laughter mixing with the clatter of buckets. Women spun wool in shaded courtyards, their hands moving in soft repetition, while men repaired tools or mended fences. Meals were simple, often bread with cheese, olives, and perhaps a bit of fruit, but they were shared with ease and gratitude. The countryside's wealth was not in gold or marble, but in the quiet abundance of enough food, enough shelter, enough to see each day through to the next. Seasonal festivals brought a different but still gentle energy to these rural spaces. At harvest, villagers gathered with music and offerings, thanking the gods for what the earth had given. Simple dances were performed, children joined hands, and tables were set with fresh bread, wine, and fruit. The celebrations were not lavish but heartfelt, binding the community together in gratitude and continuity. At springtime, when planting began, small rituals blessed the soil, asking for rain and sun in good measure. These moments gave the countryside its quiet joy, marking the year not just by labour, but also by shared rest and reflection. The Roman countryside also carried its own quiet beauty in the landscape itself. Hills rolled gently, covered with grass and dotted with wildflowers that shifted with the seasons. Streams traced silver lines through valleys, their waters cooling the air and watering the fields. Trees stood scattered, cypress tall and dark, oaks broad and strong, poplars whispering in the breeze. The land was never silent, yet its sounds were always soft. The rustle of leaves, the chirping of birds, the buzzing of bees in the blossoms. For those who lived here, these sounds were not noticed as interruptions, but accepted as the background of life, as natural as breath itself. Evenings in the countryside carried a calmness deeper than the city could ever know. As the sun dipped low, the fields glowed golden, then slowly darkened into shadow. Families finished their tasks, animals settled, and smoke curled gently from hearths as meals were prepared. Lamps and torches glimmered faintly at villa doors, but most of the countryside lay under the stars without much light at all. Night sounds filled the quiet. The hoot of an owl, the rustle of a small creature in the grass, the faraway bark of a dog. In these moments, life seemed to shrink into the immediate and the simple. A hearth fire, a shared meal, the slow drift into sleep. The countryside did not shout its importance, yet Rome depended on it utterly. Without its fields there would be no bread, without its vineyards, no wine, without its groves, no oil, without its herds, no wool or milk. The grandeur of the city rested upon this foundation of quiet labour, unseen by many but known by all. And for those who lived in the countryside, this labour was not a burden but a way of life, steady and patient, giving them a closeness to the rhythms of earth that the city could never quite match. So the Roman countryside breathed through its fields, its groves, its pastures, and its homes, with a rhythm both calm and eternal. Its life was not marked by triumphs or monuments, but by the slow unfolding of seasons, the quiet persistence of work, and the gentle continuity of generations. For the weary listener, it offers rest, a reminder that history is not always told in noise and movement, but also in silence, patience, and the calm turning of the earth. Yet the Roman countryside was not made only of small farmyards and shepherds' fields. It was also dotted with villas, country houses that ranged from modest retreats to grand estates. To step into a villa was to see another layer of rural life, one shaped by both comfort and labour. for comfort and labour. Some villas were simple, little more than farmhouses with tiled roofs and shaded courtyards where a family lived close to the soil they worked. Others stretched wide, with colonnades, gardens and pools, designed as retreats for wealthy Romans who wished to escape the city's noise. But even the grandest villas were tied to the land around them. Their walls opened onto orchards, fields and pastures. The houses themselves were often centres of production, with storerooms for grain, presses for olives, vats for wine, and workshops for wool, Slaves and hired labourers moved through these spaces quietly, their work steady, their presence constant. The villa was not only a place of leisure, but also a working heart of the countryside, binding wealth and harvest together. For many Romans of high standing, a villa in the countryside offered a kind of peace that the city could not. Here, the air was clearer, the horizon wider, the pace slower. Letters from ancient writers sometimes describe mornings spent walking through gardens, afternoons reading in shaded porticos, evenings dining while listening to the sounds of cicadas in the field. Yet alongside these gentle pleasures was always the awareness of the land's labour, for without the workers in the fields, the villa's calm meals and shaded walks could not exist. Travellers passing through the countryside saw all of this unfold in quiet layers, whereas roads stretched outward from the city, paved and steady, bordered by milestones that marked the distance. On these roads, carts creaked as they carried goods inward, sacks of grain, jars of oil, baskets of fruit. At the same time, carts carried goods outward, pottery, cloth, tools, bound for villages or rural estates. The roads were never crowded like those in the city, but they were steady veins of connection, keeping the countryside and the capital in constant conversation. Villages, too, dotted the land, small clusters of homes gathered around a well or a crossroads. These villages were modest, but they offered rest to travellers and community to those who lived nearby. A small tavern might serve watered wine and simple bread. A shrine might stand at the village edge, where offerings were left to local gods or spirits of the land. Life here was close-knit and predictable, shaped by the same fields and seasons as the farms beyond. For many Romans, such villages were home, places where one was known, where faces were familiar, where the same festivals returned year after year. Labour in the countryside was not rushed, though it was constant. Farmers rose with the dawn, often beginning their work before the sun was fully in the sky. Fields had to be tended, animals fed, tools repaired. Tasks repeated with little change. Sowing in autumn, tending in spring, harvesting in summer. Each season had its duty, had its rhythm. The tools were simple, wooden ploughs, iron sickles, baskets woven from reeds, but in skilled hands they carried the land through its endless cycles. What might seem tiring was, in truth, grounding, for each act was connected to the life of the community. Children in the countryside often shared in this work from an early age. They might carry water, scatter grain for chickens, or gather firewood from nearby groves. Yet they also had their play, chasing each other through meadows, climbing trees or fashioning small toys from twigs and clay. Their laughter mixed with the hum of bees and the lowing of cattle, giving the countryside a softer layer of life. Generations overlapped easily here, with grandparents teaching skills, parents guiding tasks, and children slowly stepping into the rhythm that would one day be theirs to continue. The countryside also held its own small mysteries and stories. Springs and groves were often thought to be sacred, touched by the presence of nymphs or local spirits. Farmers left offerings at certain stones or trees, murmuring thanks or asking for protection. These acts were not elaborate, but woven into daily life, reminders that the land itself was alive, that behind the soil and harvest there was a spirit worth honouring. Such beliefs gave the countryside a sense of quiet companionship, as though humans and earth worked together in patient agreement. In times of war, the countryside was vulnerable, for armies sometimes marched across fields, consuming supplies or damaging crops. Yet in most years the land endured, and life returned to its cycles. Even emperors knew the importance of keeping the countryside peaceful, for unrest among farmers meant shortages in the city. Thus, the countryside, though quiet, held power, a silent power that fed and stabilized Rome. One might think of the countryside as a wide tapestry, woven not from bright colours but from soft, enduring threads. Each field, each grove, each flock, each home, all were parts of a greater pattern, repeated yet never tiresome. The land offered continuity. A boy who learned to guide oxen at 10 might be doing the same at 40, his own son beside him. A woman who spun wool in her youth would still spin it in her age, her hands moving with the same steady rhythm. Generations passed, yet the countryside changed little, holding its people in a gentle sameness that was comforting rather than dull. As the day slipped toward evening, this continuity became even more apparent. Farmers gathered their tools and walked homeward, children ran ahead, animals were brought into pens. Meals were simple but satisfying, bread dipped in oil, perhaps a stew of lentils or vegetables, a cup of wine. Conversations were soft, often about the day's work or the next day's needs. As darkness fell, families gathered around hearth fires, the flames dancing on walls, the smoke curling upward into the night. Outside, the countryside stretched into silence, broken only by the distant bark of dogs or the soft stir of wind in the trees. Night in the countryside carried a deep quiet, a quiet far larger than the city's sleep. Stars shone in wide abundance, their light clear without the glow of lamps or torches to dull them. The moon traced its slow path over fields and hills, silvering the wheat and vines, touching the olive trees with gentle light. For those who paused to look, the countryside at night felt eternal, as though the land itself was breathing calmly beneath the sky. Sleep came easily here, not as escape, but as a continuation of the day's steady rhythm. Rest folded naturally into work, just as night folded naturally into day. And so the Roman countryside stood, not in grandeur, not in clamour, but in patience and persistence. Its fields whispered with wheat, its hills shone with vines and olives, its pastures murmured with flocks. Its homes glowed with hearthlight, its villages hummed with quiet community, its villas balanced labour and leisure. Above all, it gave life to Rome, not in sudden burst, but in the long, calm offering of the earth itself. For those listening now, weary and ready for rest, the countryside offers a lesson. That life can be steady and soft, that history is not only in battles and triumphs, but in the quiet turning of seasons, in the endless giving of soil, in the simple meal, shared at day's end. The Roman countryside was not loud, and it was not hurried. It was calm, enduring and eternal. A lullaby written in fields and hills, carried on breezes, and sung across generations. And so, as the hearth fire fades, as the animals settle, as the stars look down, the countryside of Rome continues its gentle breath. A reminder of calm that has lasted longer than empires, and will last still long after the noise of history has passed. Food in Rome was never just sustenance, it was rhythm, memory and community. From the humblest loaf of bread shared at a farmer's table to the intricate courses of a senator's banquet, food bound Romans together in ways both ordinary and profound. And yet, for all its variety, Roman food carried a certain patience. Meals unfolded slowly, their preparation deliberate, their enjoyment unhurried. To imagine the food of Rome is to imagine the daily breath of life, steady, nourishing, and calm. At the heart of Roman nourishment was grain, most often wheat, ground into flour and baked into bread. The bread of the ordinary Roman was simple, round loaves with firm crusts, sometimes scored on top into wedges so they could be broken easily. Bakers, working in ovens that glowed with steady heat, kneaded, shaped, and baked these loaves by the thousands. The smell of bread drifted through streets and markets warm and grounding. For many, bread was not just food, it was the foundation of the day. A piece of bread dipped in oil, perhaps with a few olives, was enough to carry one through hours of labour. Alongside grain came the gifts of the countryside. Olives pressed into oil, grapes crushed into wine, vegetables pulled fresh from gardens. Lentils and beans simmered in pots forming stews that were both filling and gentle. Cheese made from the milk of goats and sheep added richness to simple meals. Fish, brought from the sea or raised in ponds, was salted and preserved, ready to flavour stews or to serve as a dish in its own right. Meat was rarer for most, yet when it appeared, perhaps pork, perhaps chicken, it was savoured slowly, cooked with herbs and shared among many. Kitchens in Rome were small, often little more than a hearth, with a few clay pots and iron pans. Firewood was stacked carefully, the smoke curling upward through holes in the roof or drifting through open courtyards. Women, servants, or slaves moved steadily through their tasks, chopping vegetables, stirring stews, kneading dough. The work was not hurried. It followed the natural pace of fire and flame, of water boiling, of bread rising. Meals could not be rushed any more than seasons could. To cook in Rome was to join a rhythm that stretched back through generations. Markets brought colour and variety to this rhythm. Early in the morning, vendors arrived with baskets and jars, setting out their goods on wooden stalls. the air filled with mingled scents, the brine of salted fish, the sweetness of figs, the sharpness of garlic, the earthiness of fresh herbs. Customers strolled slowly, choosing carefully, bartering gently. There was no rush, for the market was as much a place of meeting as of buying. Neighbours exchanged greetings, farmers shared news of weather and harvests, children tugged at their mothers' robes while eyeing trays of nuts or honeyed cakes. The market was a living space, where food carried not only nourishment but also community. In poor homes, meals were simple: bread, porridge, vegetables, perhaps a little cheese or dried fish. In richer homes, meals unfolded with greater variety. Breakfast, in Taculum, was usually light, bread with honey, cheese or fruit. Midday brought prandium, another modest meal, perhaps leftovers from the day before, perhaps cold cuts or a small salad. It was in the evening with Sina that meals grew longer, especially in households of wealth. Here, the feast could last hours, stretching from the first bite of eggs or olives to the final sweetness of dates and nuts. At such feasts, guests reclined on couches arranged around low tables. Servants moved quietly, carrying trays, pouring wine, refreshing dishes. The courses came slowly, one after another: starters of eggs, olives or oysters, main dishes of roasted meats, seasoned fish or stewed vegetables, desserts of fruits, pastries and honeyed delicacies. Between courses, conversation flowed, unhurried and calm, drifting from politics to poetry, from philosophy to gossip. The feast was not merely eating. It was a performance of leisure, of shared time, of belonging to the slow rhythm of Roman sociability. Wine was the constant companion of meals, though it was never drunk neat. Romans diluted their wine with water, a practice that softened its strength and allowed it to be sipped steadily through the evening. Cups were refilled gently, not hastily, as to drink too much too quickly was seen as poor form. Wine was often flavoured, with herbs, with honey, with spices, turning each cup into something both familiar and slightly new. The clink of cups, the soft murmur of toasts, the smile of friends raising glasses, all these formed part of the calm music of a Roman meal. Not every feast was private. Public festivals often brought food to the streets, where citizens shared in offerings or enjoyed meals provided by magistrates seeking favour. Temples held sacrifices, and the meat was sometimes distributed among the people, giving even the poor a taste of foods they rarely could afford. In amphitheatres and arenas, vast numbers of citizens gathered not only for spectacle, but also for shared meals, carrying bread and fruit, sharing wine, breaking their loaves as the day unfolded. Food in these settings was a bond that softened the edges of class, even if only for a moment. Food also carried memory. A loaf baked in the same oven as one's mother had baked before, a stew simmered with herbs from the family garden, a cup of wine poured from vines tended by a grandfather. All of these tied Romans to their past. Meals became threads of continuity, weaving personal history into daily sustenance. In the quiet act of eating, Romans found themselves joined not only to their families and neighbours, but also to ancestors and traditions that stretched deep into time. There was, too, a calmness in the balance between modest meals and lavish feasts. A farmer eating bread and olives beneath a tree, and a senator reclining at a banquet in the city, lived very different lives, yet both partook in the same essential rhythm. Both broke bread, both drank wine, both found nourishment in the gifts of earth. The scale changed, the flavours varied, but the heartbeat of food was the same, steady, grounding, shared. For those who lived this rhythm, food was never only about the body. It was also about trust and peace. To share a meal with someone was to affirm connection, to acknowledge friendship, to set aside quarrels for the moment. Across classes, across settings, meals calmed and drew people together. Even emperors, who feasted with luxury, understood the power of food as a symbol: bread and grain distributed to the people, wine shared at festivals, banquets given as signs of generosity. The empire was held not only by legions, but by loaves, by the steady assurance that the people would be fed. And when the day ended, when the hearth fires dimmed and the last cups were drained, food left its gentle memory behind. The taste of bread, the scent of herbs, the warmth of shared wine lingered in thought as sleep approached. Food was not loud, nor hurried, nor fleeting. It was steady, slow and enduring, a daily feast of calm, nourishing both body and spirit. The foods of Rome, while varied, were never hurried, and in their preparation we see not only the practical work of cooking, but also the rhythm of patience. To rise before dawn and place grain into the millstone was to begin a quiet ritual. The stone, guided by hand or turned by mule, ground slowly, never in haste, producing flour in its own time. Flour became dough only after steady kneading, the pressing and folding of hands moving rhythmically. The dough then needed to rest, to rise, to transform by waiting. Nothing in Roman food was instant. Every step required stillness, pause, and the trust that time itself would complete the work. Olives, too, taught patience. They were gathered by hand from groves that had stood for decades, even centuries, trees whose roots reached deep into Roman soil. To press them into oil meant crushing, straining, waiting for liquid to separate and settle. The oil, golden and clear, carried within it the calm of the trees themselves. It burned in lamps, it softened bread, it flavoured stews, it soothed skin. When Romans dipped their bread into oil, they tasted not only nourishment, but the slow passage of seasons, the cycles of harvests, the endurance of groves that would outlive them. Wine offered a similar lesson. Grapes were pressed in autumn, their juice flowing into clay jars and wooden barrels. There they rested, transforming quietly over weeks and months into wine. Romans respected this process. They did not force it, for they knew that good wine came only through stillness and time. When poured at a meal, diluted with water, flavoured with herbs or honey, wine was more than a drink. It was a gift of patience, a sip of the year's calmness, a reminder that life ripens slowly. Roman food was marked too by the blending of places. From Greece came olives and fish sauces, from Egypt grain and exotic spices, from Gaul cheeses and cured meats. Conquered provinces sent their flavours back to Rome, yet once within the city, these foods became part of a shared rhythm. An amphora of wine from the islands, a basket of figs from the provinces, a jar of honey from distant fields. Each was set upon Roman tables with the same calm ceremony. The empire stretched far, but at the meal, it all came together in one gentle act of eating. The quiet meals of ordinary households may seem plain to us now, but they carried a steady dignity. A family might gather in the atrium or courtyard, sitting on stools rather than reclining couches, their meal laid out on a modest table. The father might break bread, the mother ladle stew, the children reach for olives or fruit. Their voices were soft, their pace unhurried. There was no need for grandeur. The act of eating together was itself a feast. Even in smallness there was fullness. In wealthier homes, where feasts stretched into the night, calmness still shaped the ritual. Though dishes were numerous and courses many, though music and conversation filled the air, the movement of the feast remained deliberate. Servants stepped quietly, pouring wine with careful hands, presenting platters one after another, never rushing the flow. Guests leaned back upon couches, speaking in measured tones, their gestures languid. A Roman banquet was not frantic indulgence, but a slow unfolding, a theatre of leisure, a celebration of taking one's time. Even laughter at the feast had its rhythm. Jests and stories passed from one guest to another, not in a hurry to arrive, but meandering like a stream. A poem might be recited, its verses drifting into the air. A guest might hum a tune, another might answer with a memory. The clinking of cups punctuated the flow, steady as a heartbeat. In such moments, food and company merged into a shared calm, an assurance that life, at least for the evening, was whole. Children, too, learned from meals. They watched bread being broken, heard prayers spoken to household gods, tasted the first fruits of harvests. For them, food was memory in the making. Years later, as adults, they would recall the scent of their mother's stew, the crunch of bread from the family oven, the sweetness of figs in summer. These memories were gentle anchors, tying them to home, to kin, to a sense of continuity. Rome was vast and ever-changing, but food held it still for a moment. There was also ritual in sacrifice, where food touched the divine. In temples, animals were offered to the gods, their smoke rising as prayer. Yet part of the meat was shared among worshippers, eaten together as a sacred meal. It's a sacred meal. To consume food in such a setting was to partake in calm communion, to believe that the gods themselves had joined in the nourishment. The taste of sacrificial meat was not hurried, for it carried with it reverence. To choose slowly was to honour the moment. Street foods added another layer to the Roman rhythm. Vendors sold hot bread, chickpea pancakes, roasted nuts, sausages grilled over open fires. Passers-by stopped for a bite, standing or sitting nearby, eating with steady hands before moving on. These foods were humble, yet they gave warmth to labourers, travellers and children alike. They were the quiet comfort of a city always awake, always hungry, always needing its steady pulse of nourishment. In villas scattered through the countryside, food echoed the slower pace of rural life. Farmers rose with the sun, worked through fields, and paused for meals beneath olive trees. Bread, cheese, olives, wine, nothing lavish, yet everything sustaining. In the cool of evening, families gathered around wooden tables, their voices soft, their gestures easy. Stars began to appear, lamps were lit, and bowls were passed around with steady hands. These meals, small as they were, carried the peace of the countryside, the hush of fields after harvest, the slow turning of the seasons. Romans also found calm joy in sweets, modest though they often were. Dates stuffed with nuts, honey drizzled over cheese, cakes flavoured with poppy seeds or dried fruit. These were simple, yet each bite carried delight. Honey especially was treasured, for it was nature's sweetness gathered slowly by bees, stored carefully, and shared sparingly. To taste honey was to taste sunlight caught and softened, the calm work of bees offered to human tables. Even hunger itself had rhythm. To wait through the day for the evening meal was not seen as suffering, but as part of life's balance. The appetite sharpened, the senses heightened, and when bread was finally broken, it tasted all the sweeter. To hunger and then to eat was a natural cycle, a reminder that satisfaction comes slowly after patience. Romans accepted this rhythm, and in doing so found calm even in emptiness and emptiness. So much of Roman food, when seen from our distance, seems quiet. It was not rushed, nor filled with endless choice. It moved at the pace of harvests, of baking, of cooking, of conversation. Bread rose as it must, wine aged as it would, olives yielded oil in their own time. Meals unfolded slowly, with patience and companionship. In every dish there was the same lesson. Life is not hurried. Nourishment comes to those who wait. And so, as lamps were extinguished and the last embers in the hearth glowed faintly, Romans lay down to rest with the memory of their meals still gentle in their minds. Bread, wine, oil, fruit, simple gifts, steady and enduring. In their calmness, these foods carried Rome forward, not with noise or urgency, but with the quiet assurance of daily sustenance. Feasts ended, but the rhythm of eating continued, flowing into the next day, into the next season, into the next generation. Food in Rome was not merely survival. It was memory, patience, ritual, and bond. It was the gentle thread that tied city and countryside, rich and poor, home and empire. In every loaf broken, every cup lifted, every stew simmered, Romans found not only nourishment but calmness. And in that calmness they rested, steady and unhurried, carried softly into sleep. The life of Rome was not only feasts, not only fields and banquets, but also the steady hum of work. From dawn to dusk, hands moved, tools struck, wheels turned, and yet much of it unfolded in rhythms that were less hurried than steady, more enduring than frantic. The city and countryside alike depended on these quiet labours that did not shine in triumphal arches or grand histories, but which kept Rome alive. In the stillness before sunrise, bakers were often the first to stir. Their work began when most of the city was still dreaming, lamps flickering faintly in dark workshops. Grain, ground and stored, was mixed with water, yeast and salt. The kneading was a patient act, the pushing and folding of dough against wooden tables, the pressing of palms in slow rhythm. Great communal ovens glowed, their embers coaxed into flame, their heat waiting to transform dough into bread. By the time the streets filled with morning light, the baker's work was already complete, their loaves stacked neatly, ready to be sold or carried to homes. Their labour was quiet, unseen by most, but essential as the city's first act of sustenance. Alongside them were potters, their wheels spinning with the hum of clay being shaped. A lump of earth, damp and pliable, was coaxed by patient hands into amphorae, bowls, lamps, and jars. The wheel turned, the clay rose, narrowed and widened. Each movement was deliberate, not rushed, for haste would ruin the vessel. The kiln, too, demanded patience, its fire consuming slowly, transforming fragile clay into lasting form. The result was simple, practical, and abundant. Vessels that would carry wine, oil, water, and grain throughout the empire. The potter's wheel was not loud, nor his craft fleeting. It was steady, rhythmic, and enduring, echoing the calm pulse of human hands meeting earth. Metalworkers brought another kind of labour, their forges glowing red, their hammers striking iron with slow certainty. The clang of hammer upon anvil might sound sharp, but it was measured, never rushed. Each strike shaped tools, nails, hinges, and chains. Some forged swords and armour, but far more forged the humble instruments of daily life: hoes for farmers, knives for kitchens, fittings for doors, buckles for sandals. Fire, smoke, and hammer guided metal into form, each tool a quiet companion to work yet to come. These smiths, working in small workshops tucked into Rome's streets, created not monuments but necessities, sustaining the city with their unseen skill. Weavers, too, worked with rhythms that seemed endless. Women at home spun wool, drawing fibres steadily from spindle to thread, their fingers nimble yet calm. Looms stood in courtyards or workrooms, their frames tall, their threads stretched taut. Back and forth moved the shuttle, carrying weft through warp, creating cloth slowly, line by line. Hours became days, and days became weeks as fabric grew. Cloaks, tunics, blankets, all emerged not from haste but from patience. Each thread held the touch of a hand, the calm of repetition, the quiet of care. The fields, too, were full of labourers whose strength was steady, not hurried. Farmers guided ploughs drawn by oxen, their furrows stretching in slow lines across the soil. Seed was scattered by hand, each toss simple and enduring. In harvest, sickles moved rhythmically, cutting grain stalk by stalk, gathered into bundles carried upon shoulders. It was hard work, yet it carried with it a kind of calm. Fields demanded no frenzy, only constancy, only a willingness to return each day to the same soil, to trust in the earth's patience. In workshops near the Tiber, tanners soaked hides, cured them with salt, stretched them to dry. The process was long, sometimes pungent, yet deliberate. Leather was softened, cut and shaped into sandals, belts, harnesses and bags. Each item carried hours of unseen labour, each stitch the work of hands practised in quiet skill. A Roman soldier's sandal, a child's satchel, a farmer's harness, all bore the mark of men and women who worked not for glory, but for endurance. Stonecutters chipped patiently at blocks quarried from distant hills. Their chisels tapped rhythmically, shaping stone into paving slabs, columns, thresholds and tombs. They were not sculptors of marble gods, but craftsmen of daily surfaces, of streets and walls. Their work was rougher, simpler, yet it gave Rome its bones. To walk upon Roman roads was to tread upon the quiet labour of thousands of unseen hands, hands that chipped, lifted, set and levelled. The empire's strength lay not only in its armies but in the patient stone that bore its weight. Shipbuilders, too, gave Rome its reach. In ports and riverside yards, timbers were cut and shaped, planks fitted together, tar and pitch ceiling gaps. The creak of wood, the rasp of saws, the measured thud of hammers filled the air, but always with order, always with rhythm. Ships grew slowly, rib by rib, plank by plank, until they were ready to carry grain from Egypt, wine from Gaul, or soldiers to distant provinces. A Roman ship was no hurried construction. It was the sum of countless hours of careful labour, each beam placed with trust in time and craft. And in all of this one finds not frenzy but patience. Work was constant, yes, and often heavy, but it was not the restless hurry of later ages. It was instead the calm endurance of tasks repeated generation after generation, the quiet skill of hands trained by fathers, mothers, neighbours and guilds. Romans worked to live, and in their work they found rhythm. Their crafts were not only necessity, but also identity, a sense of belonging within the great machine of the city. Workshops hummed, fields rustled, forges glowed, looms creaked, mills turned. The sound of Rome was not only the shouts of markets or the cheers of arenas, but also these softer rhythms, the steady strike of hammer, the low murmur of weaving, the scrape of hoe against soil. These were the sounds that sustained Rome quietly, sounds that lulled even as they laboured. And when evening came, workers set aside their tools, washed their hands and returned to meals and families. Their labour did not vanish, but it faded into the background, waiting to begin again with dawn. Rome, great as it was, rested upon these countless labours, carried not by emperors alone, but by bakers and potters, weavers and smiths, farmers and tanners. Their work, steady and calm, was the heartbeat of empire. The labour of Rome did not rest only in the hands of craftsmen and farmers, but extended into countless smaller tasks, all bound together into the life of the city. Water had to be drawn, carried, and poured. Streets had to be swept. Oil lamps had to be trimmed and filled. These humble actions, often unseen, gave the city its gentle rhythm. Even the act of drawing water from a fountain was a kind of labour. A woman approached, amphora balanced upon her hip. She lowered it carefully into the stream, let the water rise, then lifted it once again. Step by step she returned home, her burden steady. To repeat this each day was tiring, yet it was also ordinary, expected, part of life's flow. Mills turned with the power of water, or the strength of donkeys, grinding grain into flour. The creak of wooden wheels, the crunch of stone upon stone, and the slow trickle of flour into sacks filled the mill house with calm persistence. Workers tended the mechanisms, adjusted stones, and carried sacks to waiting customers. Grain harvested in distant fields became flour here, and from flour, bread. Each step from plough to oven was a chain of labour, each link quiet but essential. There were also scribes, men who bent over tablets and scrolls, their pens moving carefully. Their work was not loud, nor did it carry dust or smoke, but it required concentration, patience, and discipline. To copy a contract, to record accounts, to write letters for those who could not. These were quiet forms of labour. Wax tablets bore the imprint of stylus tips, clay seals pressed with rings, papyrus rolled into neat scrolls. A Roman merchant relied upon the careful work of such scribes just as surely as he relied on ships and wagons. Their writing preserved agreements, promises, and histories, each line a product of steady labour. Teachers, too, might be counted among Rome's workers. Though their classrooms echoed with the recitation of boys learning letters and verses, the teacher himself laboured with patience. Day after day he repeated lessons, guided hands across wax tablets, corrected stumbles and urged discipline. Theirs was not physical toil but mental persistence, a slow shaping of minds. It was labour of another kind, no less repetitive, no less enduring, carried out in courtyards, porticos or rented rooms, as vital to Rome's life as the crafts of smiths or potters, and then there were builders. Though grand monuments drew the eye, most building labour was quieter. The patching of walls, the repair of roofs, the raising of small shops and dwellings. Bricks were set, mortar mixed, timber beams lifted into place. The rhythm was steady, the tools simple, hammer, trowel, saw, chisel. Even the aqueducts, so great and enduring, were built not in haste but with patience, stone by stone, arch by arch. Rome's very skyline was the product of slow and constant effort, the layering of countless hours of labour. In markets, merchants spread out goods, arranging baskets of fruit, jars of oil, bolts of cloth. Their work was quieter than that of smiths, but it was still labour, the careful measuring, the weighing of grain, the bargaining with customers. Markets were busy, but beneath the noise lay steady routines. Goods set up at dawn, stalls tended all day, wares packed away at dusk. The merchant's life was one of constancy, a rhythm of selling and restocking, a quiet weaving of labour into the city's daily flow. The transport of goods, too, was labour unending. Carters guided wagons through streets, their wheels groaning under heavy loads. Porters carried amphorae on their backs, bent slightly under the weight, step after step. Boatmen pushed barges along the Tiber with long poles, guiding them toward docks. All of these were forms of effort, not often sung in history, but which kept Rome nourished, clothed, and supplied. Without the porter's bent back or the carter's patience, the city could not breathe. Even in temples, work continued quietly. Priests and attendants swept floors, polished altars, tended fires, and prepared offerings. Their labour was sacred, but it was also daily, constant. To keep a flame alive, to arrange garlands, to wash vessels, these were acts of devotion, but also acts of persistence. The gods were honoured not only by great ceremonies, but by the quiet labour of attendants who ensured that temples were always ready, always tended. The work of women filled homes with the same steady rhythm. They wove, spun, baked, cleaned, and tended children. Their hands shaped the fabric of daily life, even if no record praised them. A mother guiding her daughter's first attempt at spinning thread, a grandmother kneading dough, a wife sweeping dust from a threshold. These were labours unmarked in monuments, but vital to Rome's quiet survival. Slaves, too, carried out much of Rome's work. Their labour, often unseen, ranged from the kitchens of grand houses to the fields of estates, from quarries to mines. Some toiled in chains, others in relative ease, but all shared in the work that built the empire. They drew water, cleaned courtyards, turned millstones, served tables, copied manuscripts, and trained children. Their lives were filled with labour, and though their names are lost, their efforts pulsed beneath the empire's grandeur like a steady hidden current. Artisans gathered into guilds, sharing skills and traditions. The shoemakers' guild, the potters, the metalworkers, each kept alive methods passed down through generations. Apprentices watched masters, learned through repetition, and in time carried on the same rhythms. rhythms. Work was not simply necessity, it was heritage, a way of belonging, a craft one carried into the next life. In the countryside, shepherds guided flocks, their days filled with walking, watching, and waiting. Their labour was patient, keeping animals safe from wolves or thieves, guiding them to pasture and water. Beekeepers tended hives, smoking bees gently, collecting honeycomb by comb. These were soft labours touched by nature, their pace set not by the clock but by the seasons, the sun, and the slow movements of animals. What unites all of this is the constancy, the steady endurance of Roman labour. Few tasks were quick. Few were done in haste. Most required patience, rhythm, and repetition, qualities that made them feel almost like breathing. In this way, work was woven into life itself. The potter's wheel spun, the loom clicked, the hammer struck, the plough cut, all with calm inevitability. When night fell, the city grew quieter, but even then some labour continued. Watchmen walked their rounds, carrying torches. Bakers returned to their ovens, beginning the next day's bread. Lamps glowed in small workshops where scribes or artisans finished tasks by candlelight. Work in Rome was never wholly still, but it was steady, unhurried, enduring. And so the great empire, with its legions and triumphs, its temples and roads, rested upon these countless acts of labour. The hammer and chisel, the shuttle and spindle, the hoe and sickle, the stylus and tablet, all were as vital as the sword and shield. Rome's strength lay not only in conquest but in the quiet persistence of work. In this way, the labour of Rome was not only survival, but a rhythm that shaped lives. For soul, it gave structure to days, meaning to skills, and continuity to generations. It was slow, steady, and calm, the hum of human effort carrying forward the life of a people, the steady heartbeat beneath the grandeur of empire. When the work of the day was done, when markets began to close, when the hammers quieted and the ploughs were put away, Romans turned to gentler pursuits. Leisure, though often simple, was as necessary as bread. It was in those hours of pause that life found balance, and men and women discovered moments of calm. Leisure in Rome did not always mean idleness. It was often a softer kind of activity, one that refreshed the mind and spirit without demanding the body's strength. A Roman might sit beneath the shade of a portico, watching the passers-by, or stroll slowly along a colonnaded street, enjoying the play of light across marble and brick. The air carried the faint sounds of conversation, of sandals upon stone, of distant fountains, and these became the background music of rest. For many, leisure began at home. Courtyards with their pools and small gardens offered a place to sit quietly in the evening. A man might recline on a couch, sipping watered wine, while his children played with knucklebones on the floor. The coolness of the evening breeze stirred the leaves of potted plants, the faint trickle of a fountain gave rhythm to the silence, and lamps cast their steady glow. Here, within familiar walls, leisure was simple: conversation, reflection, and rest after labour. Reading, too, was a gentle pursuit. Scrolls of papyrus, carefully unrolled and rolled again, carried poetry, history, or philosophy. A Roman might spend an hour with Virgil's verses, letting the rhythm of the lines calm his mind, or read the letters of Cicero, thinking over matters of friendship, duty, and the passage of time. For those who could not read, stories were read aloud. A friend or slave recited, while others listened in a circle, their thoughts carried by the words. In such moments, leisure was not noise or spectacle, but the soft turning of thought. Music often filled these hours. A lyre plucked slowly, a flute played softly, the beat of a drum kept gently with the hand. These sounds drifted through homes and gardens. Music accompanied feasts, but it also soothed the quiet moments in between. A woman at her loom might hum as she worked, her song blending with the sound of the shuttle. Children sang simple rhymes in play. The melodies were not grand, but they brought comfort, shaping leisure into something shared, familiar, and tender. Board games were another quiet delight. Roman men and women played ludus latroncularum, a game of strategy with small counters upon a grid. Others enjoyed dice, casting them across a table and laughing softly at fortune's turns. Children played with knucklebones, tossing them high and catching them on the back of their hands. These games were small, portable, requiring only a flat surface and a few pieces, but they brought joy, easing the weight of the day. Gardens were a favoured setting for leisure. Even the smallest homes sought a space for plants, for greenery brought peace to the eye and spirit. and spirit. Wealthy Romans built elaborate gardens with statues, fountains, and shaded walks. There, one could stroll slowly, observing flowers, listening to the rustle of leaves, watching birds flit from branch to branch to branch. In the countryside, gardens expanded into orchards, vineyards, and groves, where leisure meant walking among trees heavy with fruit or resting upon the grass beneath olive branches. Nature's presence, steady and calm, shaped leisure as deeply as any feast or performance. Baths were among the most beloved forms of Roman leisure, though they were also part of daily routine. To enter a bathhouse was to step away from the bustle of the streets and into a slower rhythm. Warm water, cool pools, steam-filled rooms, each offered its own kind of relaxation. Men and women, though often separated, shared in this practice, moving from chamber to chamber, pausing to converse, to sit, to soak. The bath was both cleansing and social, a place where time stretched out gently, where leisure was not hurried but prolonged. So, some Romans found their leisure in conversation itself. To sit with friends beneath a shaded portico or on the steps of a temple to exchange thoughts on philosophy, politics, or daily life, this was leisure of the mind. Words flowed slowly, questions posed, answers considered. A philosopher might speak of virtue, a farmer of crops, a soldier of distant lands, each listening to the other. Conversation was as much a pastime as any feast, requiring no tools but presence, no stage but the quiet company of others. In rural places, leisure carried its own shape. Shepherds, resting against a rock while their flocks grazed, passed the time with flute playing or song. Farmers, after a day in the fields, sat at their thresholds, watching the sun sink behind hills. Children ran barefoot through meadows, laughing as they chased one another. Leisure here was woven into the land itself, unplanned, arising from the natural pauses between tasks. Festivals, too, though filled with activity, were for many a form of leisure. When work paused, people gathered to watch races, processions, or dances. These moments, though more lively, were still shaped by rhythm rather than urgency. Music, offerings, and laughter mingled in the air, and for a time the cares of work and trade slipped away. Even the grand spectacles of Rome, though crowded, gave people the chance to rest from their labour and lose themselves in shared delight. But leisure could also be deeply personal. A man sitting alone with his thoughts, gazing at the stars. A woman combing her hair slowly before sleep. A child lying on the ground, tracing patterns in the dust with a stick. These moments were not recorded, not praised in stone or scroll, but they were as much leisure as feasts and games. They were the simple, private spaces in which life softened, where time moved more gently, and where the mind could drift into calm. In Rome, as in all places, leisure was necessary. It was the pause that gave shape to labour, the breath between the beats of a song. Without it, life would have been a chain of toil. With it, life gained rhythm, softness, and balance. And so Romans, whether rich or poor, citizen or slave, found ways to rest, to play, to enjoy moments of calm. Leisure in Rome was not a single pattern, but a tapestry of many small and larger moments woven together across the lives of citizens, freedmen, and slaves alike. If the morning had been for labour and duty, and the noon for errands and commerce, then the afternoon and evening often opened space for leisure. This rhythm gave shape to life, as natural as the rising and setting of the sun. In the homes of the wealthy, leisure often took the form of long meals that stretched across the hours. The dining couch invited repose as much as nourishment. One reclined not in haste, but in ease, eating in slow intervals, listening to conversation or music between each course. Guests lingered after dishes were cleared, speaking softly under lamplight, as though time itself had softened to accommodate the gathering. The body rested, the mind wandered, and leisure unfurled gently. Yet in simpler homes, leisure was no less present. A craftsman might return from his shop, weary but content, and sit with his family at a wooden table. Bread, olives, and cheese were shared. Laughter accompanied the meal. Afterward, perhaps, the children played outside under fading daylight, while the adults spoke together of the day. There was no grand display, no costly entertainment, but leisure lived fully in such ordinary moments. Storytelling, especially in the evenings, carried its own quiet pleasure. By firelight, tales of ancestors, myths of the gods, and histories of heroes were recited. Old men told of battles long past. Women shared family lore. Children repeated fables of animals that spoke with human voices. The rhythm of words, the gentle tone of the speaker, the hush of those listening, all combined into a kind of leisure that reached across generations. The stories often repeated with little variation, yet this familiarity was itself part of the comfort. For some, leisure came through observation rather than participation. A man might lean upon a railing overlooking a forum, not to trade or argue, but simply to watch the ebb and flow of people. He saw the merchants calling out prices, the children chasing one another, the priests walking solemnly in robes. From this quiet vantage, life itself became a spectacle, requiring no coin, no arrangement, only the patience to linger. One of the gentlest forms of leisure was the Roman appreciation for nature. Villas in the countryside were designed to face wide views of fields, hills, or rivers. To sit and gaze upon a vineyard spreading across a slope or a herd grazing in the distance was considered a pleasure of the mind as much as of the eye. City dwellers, when possible, sought the same solace in smaller ways, perhaps through a stroll along the Tiber's banks or by tending a small plant in a courtyard pot. Even the smallest glimpse of nature softened the day. Children's amusements, too, formed part of the fabric of leisure. Their games, though simple, carried joy. Hoops rolled along streets, balls tossed between friends, dolls dressed and redressed with scraps of fabric. Chalk marked out patterns for hopping games, while small carts were pulled with strings. The sound of children's laughter drifting into the evening was itself a form of communal leisure for those who listened, a reminder of innocence and lightness amid daily toil. Animals often accompanied leisure. Dogs followed their masters on walks, played with children, or sat beside the hearth. Birds, kept in cages, sang in courtyards. Some Romans admired exotic pets, but many found delight simply in the presence of a faithful animal. Their movements, their sounds, and their companionship formed a quiet layer of amusement that did not fade with age or circumstance. Theatrical performances, though grander than household games, also belonged to leisure. Plays were staged in open-air theatres where audiences sat beneath the sky. Comedies, with their playful exaggerations, drew laughter. Tragedies stirred more sombre reflection. Even the simplest farce, with actors in masks and gestures broad enough for all to understand, provided an escape from the seriousness of daily life. The theatre was communal leisure shared by many at once, yet it invited each person to feel lighter, if only for an hour. Poetry readings offered another, more intimate form of entertainment. A poet might gather a few listeners in a portico or garden, reciting verses while the audience reclined. The rhythm of language, the careful choice of words, the cadence of the voice, all these created a leisure of listening. Even when the poems spoke of wars or storms, the act of hearing them in a calm setting became soothing. The mind wandered, carried by words, much as one might drift upon a gentle stream. Leisure was not only about enjoyment, it was also about restoration. The Romans understood that the body strained by work or travel needed intervals of ease. A soldier on leave stretched upon the grass. A farmer sat quietly in his orchard. A mother rested her back against the wall after carrying water. These moments were as important as festivals and feasts. They were small, uncelebrated, yet essential to the rhythm of life. Even festivals, though often filled with noise, contained pauses of calm. Between the races of the circus or the dances of Saturnalia, there were lulls in which people spoke softly, watched the sky, or simply allowed their minds to drift. The great events of Rome were not only spectacles, they were occasions for gathering, for leaving behind work, for breathing in a different kind of time. Leisure existed in the intervals as much as in the events themselves. Night, above all, was leisure's companion. When lamps were extinguished and the city grew quiet, people lay upon their couches or beds, listening to the silence broken only by distant sounds. The creak of a cart, the bark of a dog, the sigh of wind in the eaves. Dreams were the final leisure, ungoverned, unfolding slowly until morning returned. For Romans as for us, the hours of rest were the most constant, the most universal, and the most necessary form of leisure. And so, in Rome, leisure was found everywhere. In games and gardens, in music and meals, in theatres and bathhouses, in the smallest pause between tasks and the grandest festival. It was not measured by riches alone, nor confined to the powerful. Rather, it flowed gently through the days and nights, balancing toil with rest and shaping life into something more than labour. As we leave this chapter, we see Roman leisure not as spectacle but as rhythm, not as rare but as everyday. It was the laughter of children, the plucking of a lyre, the slow stroll along a shaded path, the gathering of friends in conversation. These moments, quiet and enduring, remind us that across centuries, leisure has always been the soft thread that weaves through life, giving it both texture and repose. Faith in ancient Rome was not a single grand act, nor a sudden thunderclap of belief, but a steady presence woven into daily life, as constant as the rising sun or the turning of the seasons. To be Roman was to live within a world where gods watched quietly, where rituals guided even the smallest tasks, and where reverence was as natural as breathing. Religion was not apart from life. It was life itself, softened into gestures, prayers, and offerings that shaped the day. From the earliest hours of morning, faith was present. A man waking in his home might stop before a small shrine, a household lararium, where painted images of protective spirits looked down from a niche in the wall. He offered a pinch of salt or a crumb of bread, perhaps a drop of wine when available. The flame of a small lamp flickered, a symbol of continuity between past and present, ancestors and descendants. The ritual was not grand, not weighty, but a gentle acknowledgement that life unfolded under watchful eyes. These household rituals were perhaps the most constant of all. The lairs, guardians of home and family, were honoured daily. Children grew up seeing their parents bow before these small figures, learning by quiet repetition that the gods were part of ordinary meals, journeys and decisions. Before leaving the house, a man might murmur a word to his household spirits. Upon returning, he might do the same. The rhythm was subtle, reassuring, and enduring. In the countryside, too, faith breathed gently through the landscape. Farmers offered the first fruits of their labour to the earth itself, honouring deities of field and furrow. A sheaf of grain was laid aside, a cluster of grapes left unplucked, a few drops of milk spilled upon the ground. These gestures acknowledged that fertility was not solely the work of human hands, but also of unseen powers. The land was not simply soil and seed, but a living companion to be spoken to with respect. Rituals accompanied the cycles of life. At birth, offerings were made to deities who protected infants. At marriage, vows were sealed under divine witness. At death, prayers were whispered to guide the soul beyond. No moment was too small to be touched by ritual, no transition too plain to be acknowledged by faith. Yet these ceremonies, though sacred, were carried out with a softness that echoed the broader Roman way, steady, measured, and woven into the flow of life. Festivals, too, reflected this gentle integration of faith and daily rhythm. Each month carried days dedicated to particular gods. On such days, markets might quiet, people gathered, altars smoked with incense, and processions moved slowly through the streets. The Vestalia, honouring the hearth-goddess Vesta, invited matrons to walk barefoot to her temple, offering food and flowers. The Saturnalia, though lively with laughter and gifts, began with solemn prayers at Saturn's temple. Even the most boisterous celebrations began in reverence, grounding joy in ritual. Temples rose throughout Rome, their columns serene against the sky. These were not distant structures for rare occasions alone. They were woven into the everyday movements of people. A passerby might pause on the steps to whisper a hope or give thanks, while merchants left coins in the hands of statues before opening their shops. The temples were places of grandeur, but also of quiet habit, familiar as landmarks yet always carrying an air of sanctity. Priests dressed in white robes moved softly through these spaces, tending fires, sprinkling offerings, and chanting prayers. Their presence was dignified but not imposing, for the people themselves carried faith in countless smaller ways. Religion was not confined to a priestly class. It belonged to every hand that offered grain, every voice that spoke a prayer, every heart that lifted a quiet thought to the unseen. The Romans also believed deeply in the spirits of ancestors, the manes, who lingered beyond death but remained close to the living. Families tended to their memory with annual rituals, offering food and drink at tombs. These gatherings were not sorrowful but calm and reflective, a mingling of remembrance and presence. To share bread at a graveside, to pour wine upon the earth, was to acknowledge that family stretched across generations, bound by ritual as much as by blood. Even journeys were accompanied by faith. Before crossing a threshold, before setting out upon a road, before launching a ship, small offerings were made. A bird's flight across the sky might be read as a sign. A chance encounter could be taken as an omen. These moments were not overwhelming, not filled with dread, but gentle reminders that the world was full of meaning waiting quietly to be noticed. The augurs, skilled in interpreting omens, held a respected place in society, yet even without them ordinary Romans found guidance in small signs. The pattern of clouds, the behaviour of animals, the shape of flames. Faith was not distant. It was as close as the breath of wind or the flicker of light. One of the most serene rituals belonged to the Vestal Virgins, who tended the eternal flame of Vesta in the heart of Rome. Day and night, the fire burned, symbol of the city's life and continuity. To walk past the temple and see its smoke rising was to feel reassured that Rome endured, guarded by the goddess of the hearth. The ritual was both communal and deeply personal, for the flame was thought to protect every home as much as the city itself. Water, too, carried sacredness. Springs, wells, and fountains were not only practical but also divine. Nymphs and river gods were honoured with garlands and offerings. To drink was not merely to quench thirst, but to receive a gift of the earth's spirits. The Tiber itself was venerated, its steady flow regarded as both protector and witness. Standing upon its banks, many whispered prayers into the current, sending their hopes downstream, mingled with the waters. In quiet ways, Romans lived among the gods as one might live among neighbours, acknowledging them daily, offering courtesies, respecting their presence. The rituals were not burdens but comforts, giving shape to days, linking the human and the divine in patterns that soothed as much as they sanctified. Faith was not a distant demand but a constant companion, calm and enduring. As evening fell, shrines once more flickered with lamplight. Families gathered to murmur prayers, to place small offerings upon altars, to thank the gods for the day. The city quieted under the watch of its many temples, while in every home the smallest rituals echoed the largest. Faith, like leisure, like labour, was part of the rhythm of Rome, steady and serene. As night deepened over Rome, the rhythms of faith did not cease but softened into the quiet hours. Lamps flickered before household shrines, their dim flames echoing the eternal fire, tended by the Vestals. In these moments, the city seemed to breathe in unison with its gods, as though the divine were woven into the hush of sleep itself. Families knelt or stood in silence, their gestures modest, their words few, but their meaning profound. A recognition that human life and divine presence were forever entwined. The Romans lived not with one god but with many, each attending to a sphere of life. To outsiders, this might seem like a burden, so many deities to honour, so many rituals to observe. But to the Romans, it was a source of comfort. Life was too vast, too varied, to be overseen by a single figure. Instead, the gods shared their duties like neighbours tending different corners of a common field. Jupiter watched over the sky, Juno protected marriage, Minerva guarded wisdom, Mars lent strength to soldiers, while countless lesser spirits touched fields, doors, rivers, and crossroads. Each name carried reassurance, each presence gave meaning to the details of existence. The rituals themselves were rarely grandiose. They were practical, steady, and often simple. A pinch of grain, a few drops of wine, a whispered prayer. They were small gestures repeated faithfully, and their power lay in that repetition. The Romans believed that the bond with the divine was not forged in sudden passion, but maintained through constancy, just as friendships endure through daily kindnesses. Even the city's architecture reflected this spiritual constancy. Shrines stood at street corners, altars nestled within public squares, and temples crowned hillsides. Walking through Rome was like moving through a woven tapestry of sacred presence, each step passing a marker of divine watchfulness. To glance at a shrine while on the way to market, to see flowers laid upon an altar in passing. Such sights reminded Romans that their city was not merely stone and brick, but a dwelling place of gods. Faith also bound the community together. Public sacrifices were not private acts of devotion, but communal affirmations of belonging. When priests led a white ox or sheep to an altar, when incense smoked into the air, when prayers were spoken aloud for the health of the state, every citizen was included in the gesture. The sacrifice was not about personal gain, but collective well-being, an offering for the harmony of Rome itself. To stand in such a gathering was to feel one's life folded into something larger, a shared rhythm of reverence. And yet, alongside this public grandeur, there remain the gentlest rituals of home. A child might tie a garland of flowers around a small household statue. A mother might pour a libation before a meal. A father might whisper a blessing before setting out for work. These gestures, modest and often unnoticed beyond the walls of the home, sustained faith just as surely as the grandest festivals. Religion in Rome was not divided between sacred and ordinary. It was the ordinary made sacred. The sense of divine presence extended even to the most practical tasks. Before sowing fields, farmers honoured the gods of growth. Before harvesting, they gave thanks to the deities of abundance. Even before baking bread, a pinch of flour might be set aside in reverence. Such gestures taught patience and humility, that human effort mattered, but so too did unseen powers. The divine was never far, never absent, always attending quietly to the details of life. The Romans also believed in the quiet power of fate, or fatum. It was not a force of terror, but of inevitability, a current upon which all lives drifted. To accept fate was not to surrender in despair, but to live in harmony with what must come. The gods themselves were believed to honour fate, acknowledging its steady authority. For Romans, this belief lent calmness. To know that one's path unfolded as part of a greater order was to walk with less fear and more serenity. In the stillness of their rituals, Romans often turned to the past, honouring ancestors who had gone before. The Parentalia, an annual festival of remembrance, invited families to visit tombs, bringing food, wine and flowers. These gatherings were not sombre, but peaceful, filled with quiet conversation, gentle laughter, and the murmur of prayers. By honouring their dead, Romans wove continuity between generations, reminding themselves that life was not fleeting but part of an unbroken chain. Some rituals reached beyond family and community to the very boundaries of the state. When new cities were founded, when armies marched, when laws were enacted, ceremonies invoked divine blessing. Nothing was undertaken without acknowledgement of higher powers. The act of tracing the sacred boundary of a new settlement, for example, was both a practical and spiritual act, marking not only physical land but divine protection. Thus, Rome itself, in every stage of growth, was enfolded in ritual and vow. The Carmen Arvale, an ancient hymn sung by the Brotherhood of the Arval priests, illustrates this intertwining of life and faith. Sung for the fertility of fields, its words were passed down through centuries, intoned in voices both humble and solemn. Such chants bound the present to the distant past, preserving memory in the cadence of ritual. To hear the hymn was to be reminded that generations had cared for the same earth, prayed for the same harvests, and trusted in the same unseen guardians. The Romans did not confine their faith to one set of gods alone. Conquered lands brought new deities into their orbit, and rather than rejecting them, Rome often welcomed them. Temples to foreign gods rose alongside those of Jupiter and Mars, their rituals added to the calendar of festivals. This inclusivity did not dilute Roman religion, but enriched it, weaving diverse threads into the fabric of faith. To live in Rome was to inhabit a city where the divine wore many faces, all acknowledged with respect. For the individual, faith offered both guidance and comfort. A soldier might pray for courage, a merchant for safe travels, a mother for her child's health. These prayers were not dramatic but steady, whispered in passing, uttered beneath breath, accompanied by the simplest offerings. To pray was not to demand but to align oneself with divine order, to acknowledge dependence and to seek balance. The quietude of Roman ritual found its most striking expression in the flame. From the smallest household lamp to the great fire of Vesta, flame was a living presence, always flickering, always moving, yet never fully consumed. It represented continuity, transformation, and divine presence all at once. To watch a flame was to witness something beyond the ordinary, something both fragile and eternal. Thus, faith in Rome was never a separate sphere, but a thread woven into every part of life, into meals and marriages, into fields and markets, into cities and countryside, into birth and death alike. It soothed, it steadied, and it gave shape to existence. For Romans, to live was to believe, and to believe was to live well. As the night drew on, Rome itself seemed cradled in ritual. The last fires burned low in temples, watchmen whispered prayers as they took their posts, and families extinguished their lamps with gestures of reverence. Above them, the stars glittered, thought to be souls of the departed or lights of the divine. The city slept, but faith did not sleep. It lingered in every shadow and every silence, constant as breath, calm as the turning of the heavens. And so, the spiritual life of Rome was not a matter of thunder or tumult, but of gentle rituals, quiet faith, and enduring trust in the presence of the divine. It was a religion of constancy, woven softly into each day, shaping not only the lives of individuals but the very identity of the Roman world. The Romans did not measure life only by years or decades, nor solely by the rise and fall of leaders or empires. For them, time was carried most gently in the passage of the seasons. Each turning of the year brought its own colours, its own labours, its own festivals, and its own rhythms. To live in Rome was to live not in a single moment, but in a cycle, a circle that endlessly turned and returned, marking life with a sense of both continuity and renewal. The city itself reflected this rhythm. Spring would soften the chill of winter, with blossoming trees along the Tiber's banks. Summer would heat the paving stones, filling the air with the murmur of fountains and the cries of vendors selling cool drinks. Autumn would spill golden light across the countryside, heavy with harvests, while winter would gather families close, their lamps glowing warmly against the lengthening nights. The Romans lived these shifts not as background, but as a fundamental part of existence. At the heart of this turning year lay the calendar of festivals. More than a way of keeping time, it was a map of life itself. Nearly every month carried days marked by sacred observances, ensuring that the rhythm of the seasons was never only agricultural, but also spiritual. Time was sanctified, not left empty, and each season bore its share of rituals, songs, and processions. Spring began with hope. After the long sleep of winter, fields awoke, vines stirred, and blossoms appeared like soft promises across the land. Farmers prepared their ploughs, and households honoured the gods who guarded growth. One of the earliest festivals was the Perilia, a rustic celebration for shepherds and flocks. Fires were kindled, smoke drifted gently, and shepherds led their animals through the haze, purifying them for the new season. It was not only sheep who passed through those flames, but a sense of life itself, renewed with the warmth of spring. As spring deepened, Rome's greatest festival arrived, the Floralia, dedicated to Flora, goddess of flowers and renewal. The city blossomed with garlands, people wore bright colours, and playful games filled the days. It was a festival of life, joy and fertility, echoing the very energy of the earth as it surged back into growth. To walk Rome streets during Floralia was to feel surrounded by beauty, laughter, and a promise of abundance yet to come. Summer followed with its long days and its fullness of light. The heat could be heavy in the stone-built city, but it also lent itself to leisure, to the slow unfolding of festivals and gatherings. The Vestalia honouring Vesta, goddess of the hearth, was among the most cherished. Mothers and daughters brought offerings to her temple, and for a brief period its innermost sanctuary, usually closed to the public, was opened for women to enter. Bread was baked, fires tended, and the life-giving warmth of the hearth was celebrated. The festival bound the domestic and the divine, reminding all that the flame of home mirrored the eternal fire of the city. The summer months also carried the consualia, festivals of harvest and of horses. Beneath the blazing sun, Romans honoured consus, protector of stored grain, with races and rituals. Horses and mules, vital to labour, were crowned with flowers and given rest, a gesture of gratitude that even animals were part of the sacred cycle. To see a mule adorned with garlands, standing quietly in the shade after a year of toil, was to witness Rome's humility before the gifts of the earth. Autumn came softly but firmly, carrying with it the weight of ripened fields and the glow of vineyards heavy with grapes. The vendimia, the grape harvest, was not only an act of gathering but a festival of joy. Grapes were crushed, wine pressed, and the promise of winter sustenance secured. Families joined together in the labour, their hands sticky with juice, their laughter mingling with the hum of work. In autumn, Rome seemed wrapped in golden light, as though the land itself gave thanks for its bounty. This season also brought the October horse, a strange and solemn sacrifice to Mars, the god of war, carried out in the Campus Martius. Though unusual, it marked the close of the military campaigning season, folding war itself into the cycle of the year. Even conflict, even the harshness of battle, had its place in the turning of time. Romans knew that peace and struggle, like summer and winter, alternated with inevitability. Winter arrived with quiet weight, shortening days and cooling nights, yet it was far from barren. The Saturnalia, Rome's most famous festival, filled December with warmth and merriment. For a few days the usual order of society relaxed, masters and slaves dined together, gifts were exchanged, and laughter rang through houses. Lamps glowed in windows, evergreen branches adorned homes, and the spirit of Saturn, god of an earlier golden age, seemed to return, if only briefly. For Romans, Saturnalia was more than celebration. It was a reminder that joy and equality had once been natural to humankind and might still be glimpsed, if only for a season. Other winter rites were gentler, like the Compitalia, honouring the guardian spirits of crossroads. Folds. Families placed small figurines at shrines, offerings were given, and neighbourhoods came alive with simple acts of devotion. Winter, though cold, was thus filled with light, not the blazing light of summer, but the warm flickering glow of lamps, hearths, and candles shared in community. Through all these turnings, Romans felt themselves part of something greater than their individual lives. The seasons taught them patience, humility, and gratitude. No field could be forced to ripen before its time. No vine could bear fruit in winter. No festival could be rushed. Each moment had its place, each day its meaning. To live in Rome was to live with awareness of this rhythm, where joy and rest, labour and ritual, loss and renewal, all found their place within the circle of the year. Even death itself was folded into this cycle. Just as winter gave way to spring, so too did Romans believe life moved into another form, another season beyond sight. The festivals for the dead, gentle and dignified, affirmed this belief. Time, they felt, did not end but turned, like the year itself, forever moving forward yet always returning. Thus, the seasons of Rome were not merely weather or passing days, they were teachers, shaping how Romans worked, how they prayed, how they feasted and how they rested. They were a quiet assurance that life itself, with all its changes, was part of a greater, enduring pattern. And so, as the year circled on, Romans found comfort in the knowledge that they walked not through chaos but through rhythm, an eternal gentle music, playing softly beneath the noise of markets and the clatter of forums. In that music, they heard both the gods and the earth itself, calling them to live in harmony with time. The cycle of seasons was not only a public rhythm, but also a deeply personal one. Each household, from the humblest rural farmstead to the grand villas on Rome's hills, marked time with their own quiet rituals. A family might keep a small record of festivals on a wax tablet, not so much to measure months as to ensure that each offering, each prayer, was given in its right season. A child might remember spring not by the calendar, but by the sight of lambs in the fields, or by the fragrant crowns of flowers woven for the floralia. For an elderly farmer, autumn was not an abstraction, but the soft weight of grain in storage jars and the sigh of vines cut back after their fruit was gathered. The Roman countryside in particular bore the clearest face of the seasons. The rural year began with the ploughing of fields, guided by age-old rituals asking the gods' blessing. Oxen dragged the wooden plough, carving lines through the dark soil. To watch the furrows unfold was to witness the opening of the year itself, the earth laid bare for planting. The farmer's life was one of patience, waiting upon rains, watching the skies, adjusting to the kindness or severity of nature. But in his patience, he learned wisdom. He knew when to sow, when to reap, when to leave a field fallow. In this way, the land taught him the very same lessons the city marked with festivals, to honour the turning of time and not to fight against it. Even the animals moved in these rhythms. Lambing time in spring brought new life, with tiny cries in the fields and mothers guarding their young. In summer, bees hummed thick in the air, their honey gathered as a gift from the season. Autumn drove flocks and herds homeward, toward warmth and shelter, while winter let them rest in barns filled with the scent of hay. To a Roman shepherd, to a goatherd, or to a beekeeper, the year was not counted on tablets but on these living signs, each season written in the voices of creatures and the feel of the air. The city of Rome itself also responded to seasonal change, though in subtler ways. In the height of summer, the great city often grew quiet as many of its wealthier citizens retreated to the countryside or to seaside villas, seeking cooler breezes. Those who remained in the capital adapted in their own ways, closing shutters against the glare, lingering in shaded porticos, or strolling slowly at dusk when the heat softened. The fountains and aqueducts, constant gifts of Rome's engineers, became essential companions in summer, offering refreshment as the stone streets baked in the sun. Winter, in the city, brought a different pace. Streets echoed with the sound of boots on damp paving stones, and hearth fires glowed in homes. Markets continued, though with fewer fresh fruits, replaced by grains, dried goods, and preserved foods carefully prepared during earlier months. The forums were quieter, yet not silent. Life continued, but at a slower, more inward rhythm. Families gathered closer in winter evenings, lamps casting gentle light over conversation and storytelling. In such times, memory itself became a comfort, recollections of past festivals, harvests or Saturnalia feasts carrying warmth through the colder nights. The cycle of the seasons was also deeply bound with Rome's understanding of fate and fortune. The Romans believed that time itself was shaped by divine order. Just as crops could not flourish without both rain and sun, so too did human life require both joy and trial. Fortune to them was like the weather, sometimes kind, sometimes harsh, but always moving, always changing. To live wisely was to endure both drought and plenty with equal steadiness, knowing that no season lasted forever. Festivals reflected this balance. The joyous days of Saturnalia were always followed by quieter, more restrained rituals, just as summer was followed by autumn. Even mourning had its place in the year, such as during the Parentalia in February, when families visited tombs and offered food and wine to the spirits of their ancestors. These acts were not grim, but gentle reminders that loss too was part of the eternal rhythm. The dead were not forgotten, but folded into the circle of time, honoured and remembered each year without fail. The Romans also aligned the cycles of the year with their sense of history. They imagined earlier ages of humankind, golden and peaceful, giving way to harsher times, much as summer yields to winter. Yet they believed in renewal. Just as spring follows winter unfailingly, so too could societies, and even individuals, find renewal after hardship. The turning of the year was therefore not simply practical but symbolic, a lesson that life itself was never linear, but circular, always offering another beginning. Children especially felt the magic of the seasons. They counted the year not in years but in festivals, eagerly awaiting Saturnalia with its bright lamps and playful exchanges, or the Floralia with its games and flowers. They learned early that the world was not uniform, but changing, each part of the year bringing something to anticipate, to cherish, or to endure. To a child, the passage of time was not a burden but a wonder, each festival arriving like a friend who returned every year without fail. The elderly, too, found comfort in the cycle. With many seasons behind them, they could look upon the year not with impatience but with understanding. Each return of spring reminded them of youth, each harvest of past labours, each Saturnalia of joy once shared. For them, the turning year was not merely repetition but continuity, a way of remaining part of life even as years slipped by. The eternal cycle offered reassurance that though individual lives passed, the rhythm endured, binding all generations together. To stand in Rome at the turning of any season was to feel part of this rhythm. In spring, the scent of blossoms drifted across the forum. In summer, cicadas sang in the countryside, their endless notes echoing through warm evening. In autumn, the air grew softer, filled with the fragrance of grapes and grain. In winter, the sound of laughter at Saturnalia warmed the streets against the long night. The city and the land were not static, but alive, breathing in time with the great cycle of the year. And so, as the seasons moved, so too did the Romans. They laboured, feasted, mourned, prayed, and rejoiced in step with the wheel of time. Their lives were not separate from the earth, but woven into it, tied by ritual, by harvest, by celebration, and by memory. They lived with the deep assurance that life itself was a turning circle, and that to walk through the year was to walk in harmony with something greater and enduring. As our sleepy Roman journey draws to a close, we may imagine standing in that eternal city as the sun sets over the Tiber. Perhaps it is spring, and blossoms drift upon the water. Perhaps it is summer, and the air hums with warmth. Perhaps autumn has gilded the fields, or winter lamps glow against the dark. Whatever the season, Rome breathes with a steady rhythm, eternal yet always changing. The Romans are long gone, their streets worn by time, their voices faded into history. Yet the cycle of the seasons remains just as it was for them, carrying life gently forward. And in that rhythm, in that eternal turning of time, we find the same quiet lesson they once lived by, that every ending is a beginning, every winter a prelude to spring, and that life itself, in all its beauty and transience, is part of an endless gentle circle. The night is deepening slowly and gently. The glow of the lamps has faded, the embers of the fire are cooling, the streets are quiet, the fields are still, and the rivers flow with calm and steady ripples. All of Rome, its homes, its streets, its fields, its craftsmen, its prayers, and its harvests, has drifted by like a long, gentle story. And now everything begins to blur, like old memories, soft and distant, soothing to the heart and heavy to the eyes. The evening of Rome has set upon the sky, and with it our story too drifts into silence. There is nothing left to do now. No noise, no worry, no questions, only stillness, only calm, only rest. And when sleep comes, this Roman journey will turn into a dream where time moves slowly, and life is nothing but another name for peace. Good night, Rome. Good night, listener. Crescent sparkles.